Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Pollinator Policy Forum being held here in Maplewood. Thank you for Maplewood for opening up their wonderful community center. We've got the mayor has joined us here. Thank you, Mayor. And what a beautiful facility. And we have some other guests here from elected officials that are helping me host this. It's Representative Joanne Ward here, and Representative Fisher and Senator Uyghur are also helping host. One of the neatest things is, as an elected official, is we get an opportunity to visit with the citizens and hear what's important to them. And I hate to play with the term, but clearly one of the big buzzes going on here in our state is bees and what that means. I remember a couple of years ago, I went to school in England a long time ago, but I love following what's going on in Europe. And obviously, you know, we kind of heard about it there first in Europe, of what was going on with the bee populations in Europe. Well, you know, lo and behold, of course, no surprise, it's a major issue here. And so we're trying to bring that here, and it's I know that my district is hungry for information. I know the legislature is hungry for information, and so one of the neat things for me as a legislator is we get the chance to meet experts. So not only tonight, the person that's going to host is an expert, but we've got all these people from the state and industry and citizens that have been raising bees for years, and that are on the front line and coming up with ideas to protect this. This is a nonpartisan issue. We all love food. We all love, and we know what that means. And if we don't have this population, we're in deep trouble. But one of my colleagues here is going to host tonight is Representative Rick Hansen from South St. Paul, and we're classmates. And he's coming off of parent conferences tonight, so if he's a little distracted at first, I know he'll get in the game, but he has a sixth grader, and they had parent conferences. I think they went better. I asked him how'd it go. I was just hoping they went better than mine when I was a kid. But Rick is in the legislature, been in, I think he's in his sixth term with me. We're classmates at the same time, and he's a biology major in college, and also has his master's in soils. And something a lot of people don't know about him, he's owns quite a bit of land in southern Minnesota, and so he's out there with the real fields and the real crops and living it every day, and has a huge land. And he also has a side interest that always fascinates me. He's become very good friends with the Amish population down in the Harmony area. And obviously that's interesting, as you know, much of this bee issue is, modern fertilizers and stuff. So comparing to what, he brings that perspective of what farming might have used to be compared to today and those sort of things. But with that, I'd like to have Representative Hansen come up, and we're real excited. We're going to go through the agenda, and then hopefully at the end we've got some time for some questions. And thank you everyone for coming.
Leon didn't mention that one of his nicknames for me is Tom Sawyer, because I had him come down and cut buckthorn at my farm, and he accused me of just sitting there and watching him cut the buckthorn. I did supervise him a little bit while he was doing that. Well, welcome everybody to this forum, and this is an opportunity, as Representative Lilly said, at the Capitol we often hear from experts, and so we're taught at public speaking to tell you what we're going to tell you, and then tell you what we told you. And so we're going to try to do that tonight with scientific experts who will talk about the science relating to pollinators, not just honeybees, and what they're seeing, and what the research that you fund as taxpayers in Minnesota provides from the University of Minnesota and from the Minnesota Zoo. We have the state-owned zoo, and there's a lot of work being done there and a lot of research. In terms of ground rules, there were some cards that when you came in where you could ask questions. We'd ask that during the presentations you not ask the questions, but after each panel there will be time for questions. Each speaker is going to have about 15 to 20 minutes. Many of them will have slide presentations talking about the science that they're doing. So after the science presentation, we'll have time for questions of that panel. Then there will be a panel of agency personnel talk about what your state agencies are doing. And then we will hear from some of the organizers in the beekeeping community to talk about what they're doing and also what beekeepers are seeing. And wrapping up with folks that you have in Maplewood here, what's happening in Maplewood. I should say I'm the moderator, not the IT person, so if the screen goes blank, it's not my fault, if you will indulge me. Our first speaker is Karen Oberholzer. She is a professor at the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. And she and her students conduct research on several aspects of monarch butterflies. Monarch butterfly ecology. Who here has heard concerns about monarch butterflies? Almost everybody. She obtained her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1989. Her research depends on traditional lab and field techniques as well as the contributions of a variety of audiences in citizen science. There's about a paragraph and a half here on Dr. Oberholzer. I would just like to say she's a great researcher and an asset to our state, and I'd like Karen to come up.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Representative Hansen. It's a real honor to be here speaking to all of you. What a great audience and what an exciting topic. I'm going to get my presentation up here. I just wanted to point out that at the top of the packets that you brought in, I have 3 handouts about monarch conservation, just in case I forget to say that later. There's one that describes the Monarch Joint Venture, which is a group of organizations that are collaborating on monarch conservation, federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofit organizations, and governments. So there's some background on the Monarch Joint Venture, a handout on gardening for monarchs, and a handout on all the different great kinds of milkweed that you can plant if you'd like to promote monarch conservation in your backyard. So those are there for your information. So what I'm going to talk about in my 15 minutes here is kind of the basics of monarch biology. And I always feel when I'm talking in a group that's about pollinators that I need to do a little bit of justification as why I'm here as a monarch biologist talking in a group about pollinators. So I think that one of the most important things about monarchs is that they're a flagship species. And I turned around when Representative Hansen asked you how many people recognized monarchs, and I saw that most of you raised your hands. And I would bet that a lot of people that raise their hands don't recognize very many other insects to species. You might know mosquitoes, but we actually have quite a few species of mosquitoes in Minnesota. You might know swallowtail butterflies, but we also have a lot of swallowtail butterflies. Even skippers. I know Eric will talk about skippers. You might not know individual species, but I would argue that you know monarchs as an individual species. So they are a species that engenders great interest in conservation, and by preserving habitat for monarchs, we will preserve habitat for many other organisms that are really great at pollination, like the bees you'll hear about later. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a little bit about the natural history of monarchs, the cool biology part, and I'll be happy to answer questions about that later. Then talk about why I'm here, because people are so very interested in monarchs. Then give you some evidence that monarch numbers are declining, and talk about what we can do as Minnesotans and as people in the United States and people in North America for monarch butterflies. So first of all, this amazing and complex life history that monarchs have. So when I think of monarchs, I like to think of 2 kinds of a life cycle. One is the individual life cycle that an individual butterfly goes through. Just like we have a life cycle, monarchs have a life cycle. It starts out as an egg. They're an egg for about 4 days. They're a caterpillar for anywhere from 9 to 12 days, depending on temperature. They then pupate and become a chrysalis or a pupa. They're a caterpillar for a pupa for 9 to 11 days, again, depending on temperature. Then they're adult, and the cycle starts again. So that's the individual life cycle. During this period, they depend on nectar plants as adults and milkweed as caterpillars. And you may not know, but we have over 100 species of milkweed that are native to North America, and monarchs feed on most of these. So you don't just have to use common milkweed. A lot of people have some prejudice against common milkweed, but we have a lot of very beautiful and interesting species of milkweed that monarchs will feed on. I've become a big fan lately. I don't know if the bottom right one on the slide up there is called Asclepias subulata. It's desert milkweed, and it actually has no leaves, but so the monarchs eat the stems. So we talked about the individual life cycle of monarchs, but they also have an annual cycle that the whole population goes through, and that too has 4 parts. So we're going to start with the part that's happening right now, and that's migrating south. Right now, monarchs are gathered. Most of the monarchs in the world are right now in Texas on their way to overwintering sites in central Mexico. So they've left this whole region of the United States, kind of the eastern, slightly northern, more than a quarter, about a third of the United States where they've been during the summer. They're flying through Texas. They'll get to overwintering sites in Mexico, and they'll arrive there in early November. There's another population of monarchs that lives west of the Rocky Mountains. Those overwinter along the coast of California, but we know that there's some genetic interchange between those 2 populations, with monarchs from Arizona sometimes flying down into the Mexican overwintering sites. Monarchs stay in these overwintering sites for most of the winter, from November through mid-March, and then they start heading back north. The same butterflies that flew there in the fall move into the southeastern United States, lay eggs, die, and then their offspring continue the migration north into coming back into Minnesota and the rest of the northeastern quarter of the United States. They go through 2 to 3 non-migratory generations, and then the cycle starts again with the last generation migrating back south. So it's a very amazing and complex cycle that they go through every year. Now, luckily for us, most of the monarchs are gathered in these overwintering sites, so we can count them and we can judge the status of the population by looking in the California overwintering sites. People actually estimate the numbers of monarchs that are there. And in the Mexican overwintering sites, we measure the area that they occupy, the number of hectares that are covered with monarch butterflies in the forests in these overwintering sites. So counting the butterflies at this time of the year lets us assess the status of the population. And then we can do the same thing at the end of the winter and see how they did through the course of the winter. So I'll be focusing on the eastern migratory population for the rest of this biology. And we can think of these 4 stages in terms of what monarchs need during each of the stages. As they're migrating south, right now they need nectar sources. They actually gain weight. They're putting on fat as they migrate to stay in these wintering sites all winter. They don't fly at night, so they need safe roosting spots. So these monarchs are in a mesquite tree in Texas. When they get to the overwintering sites, their goal is just to stay alive. So they actually just hang out in the trees. They don't eat very much. Every once in a while, they'll have these mass fly-ups from the trees, but for the most part, they're just sitting there. As they're migrating north in the spring, now again, they need milkweed. They didn't reproduce while they were migrating south, but when they're going north, they start using milkweed again. The butterfly here is ovipositing on green milkweed, sometimes called green antelope horns, in Texas. They need nectar as they're migrating north. And then once they get back up here, they just need lots and lots of milkweed and nectar sources. So this is where the population grows every year, and then we have the cycle starting again. So this is a cycle. It's like a chain. And in a chain, every single link is important. And if one link in a chain breaks, the whole chain falls apart. But this chain really has a basis. And every time I go to Mexico and look at the butterflies in these overwintering sites, I think of the fact that every single monarch in those trees came from a milkweed plant. And most of those milkweed plants were up here in the upper Midwestern US. So we are the base of that chain, the milkweed plants that we have here. So that's the amazing biology of monarchs. Now, just a little bit about evidence for my claim that people are very interested in monarchs. I bet a lot of you have a monarch story in your head. You remember something that happened to you with monarchs. I've heard thousands of those stories from people. So monarchs are the state insect or butterfly of 7 states, and I'm happy to say including Minnesota. And I just learned that that was a bill introduced by Senator Wigger, sitting right, you should stand and take credit for that. So that was a bill signed into law in Minnesota in 1998, and I would like to take a little credit for that because a teacher in one of my summer classes at the University of Minnesota, a 4th grade teacher, went back to her classroom and said, "We are learning about how a bill becomes a law, and what would you students like to have to make a law in Minnesota?" And her students said, "We would like monarchs to be the state butterfly." And they took that all the way up until it was signed into law by Jesse Ventura. So that was pretty exciting. So we've made monarchs our state butterflies. We create and protect monarch breeding habitat. So this breeding habitat can be at nature centers, in people's backyards, in big conservation reserve program fields, or in nature centers. So it can be in many, many different places, and monarchs can use habitat in all of these places. People protect this habitat and they label it. Over 10,000 people have labeled monarch way stations, which are resting points for monarchs in their backyards. They've labeled citizen science. This is a monarch larva monitoring project, which is something we run out of the University of Minnesota. So we're creating and protecting monarch habitat. We're using monarchs in education and classrooms in Mexico, in the United States, at nature centers, getting kids outside. So monarchs are very important for educational reasons. So people just really like monarchs for many, many reasons. But despite this interest, monarch numbers are declining. So I'm going to show you a couple kind of sad graphs right here to show you what's happening with monarch populations, then we'll talk about what we can do about that. So if you remember, I told you that we assess the status of the monarch population by looking at the area that monarchs cover during their overwintering period in Mexico. And this is a graph of what's happening to the area occupied by monarchs. Now, it doesn't take a statistician to see that that is a downward trend. It's statistically significant for those of you that like statistics. It's changed a lot. You can see there's a lot of year-to-year variation, but an overall alarming downward trend. And just to kind of give you an idea of what's happened in the time I've been studying monarchs, I first went in the winter of 1996-97, and that's that big peak on the graph. That was my first experience with these overwintering sites. It has really changed a lot in the period that I've been watching them. Because of this, many groups, organizations have noted the fact that the monarch migration is at risk. You may be familiar with the fact that there's been a petition submitted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to officially list monarchs as a threatened species. This was submitted in August of 2014. The Endangered Species Coalition put monarchs on their vanishing list in 2014. And in 2010, WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, put them as one of the top 10 species to watch in terms of conservation. And way back in 1983, the IUCN, or the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which keeps a red list of natural phenomena and organisms that we should watch out for, put the monarch migration on their red list as an endangered phenomenon, something that was in danger of disappearing. So why is this happening? And as for most species, we're losing a lot of habitat. In the United States, we're losing over 50 5,000 acres of land a day to real estate and energy development. So you can see a picture on the top there of a housing development that could have been a field that supported monarchs and bees and skippers and all sorts of great things. Between 2006 and 2011, we lost over 1 million acres of native prairie. Now that's one of the most endangered ecosystems in the United States, and that was converted into cropland. And a lot of this land contained milkweed and nectar plants that is now lost to monarchs. Also, changing agricultural practices have decreased the amount of milkweed that's available to monarchs. In the year 2000, I led a study with several other colleagues throughout the United States, and we went into cornfields and soybean fields and looked for monarchs on milkweed plants in these fields. First thing we noticed that there was quite a bit of milkweed in these fields. Obviously, that's not something that's good for the farmers, but it was good for the monarchs. They were using that milkweed. And we estimated, based on the area occupied by corn and soybean fields, the amount of milkweed in these fields and the number of monarchs that were using this milkweed, that about 50 times more monarchs came out of agricultural fields than out of non-agricultural areas. That's not twice as many, that's 50 times more monarchs. So that was an incredibly important source of milkweed for monarchs. But we've lost most of this habitat due to herbicide use on Roundup Ready or herbicide-tolerant corn and soybean plants. So you can see, I don't know if you can, but there's a little dead, shriveled up milkweed plant in the middle between those soybean rows. So this is not, I'm not here to lay blame on farmers. I'm just saying that we need to understand that that habitat is lost, and that's what we need to try to make up for. The loss of that habitat is understand the problem and try to solve it. So what can we do about this? Now, I'm a conservation biologist, and I am a strong proponent of the fact that conservation doesn't require just talking and sitting and listening to people talk. It requires action. So we need to address habitat loss. We need to create sources of nectar and milkweed for monarchs, and if we live in areas where monarchs overwinter in Mexico or California, address their need for overwintering sites. So the picture on the top there might look like a corn and soybean field, and you might be thinking, why is she showing me that? But that is actually a milkweed field, and that guy is cultivating milkweed to produce milkweed seeds for habitat restoration. We need to educate and advocate, that's what we're doing tonight, and we need to collect data to inform our conservation efforts. So just a little bit about each of these things. We can create monarch habitat anywhere, big fields, along roadsides, or in schools or people's backyards. And what we need to think about is habitat that includes milkweed for the caterpillars and nectar sources for the adults. So in Minnesota, we can plant milkweed and nectar. Any of us can do that. This needs to happen wherever it's possible, in our cities, in our suburbs, parks, ag areas, rights-of-way, railroad rights-of-way, road rights-of-way, power line rights-of-way, schoolyards, any kinds of yards. We just need more milkweed in the ground. We've estimated, we're doing a lot of work on estimating the degree to which we need to create habitat to get monarch numbers up to a viable population. We've estimated that we need 5 to 7 billion more milkweed plants in their summer breeding grounds. So we all have a lot of work to do. And it's not just milkweed, it's nectar plants as well. It's a little easier there. Any flowers, or almost any flowers you can plant, will be good for monarchs. You just need to make sure that you have nectar sources that are available throughout the season. Nectar sources in the spring. Sometimes people accuse me of being sort of a native plant Nazi, but I put a lilac plant up there on the top. And that is not a native plant, but it's a great source of nectar for them in the spring. So we have lots and lots of plants available. We need to manage correctly. So, for example, we can avoid mowing ditches in areas when monarch eggs and larvae might be present on the milkweed. We can limit insecticide spraying. So there's a lot we can do just in terms of managing the land that we have. We can encourage involvement in monarch citizen science programs because the data can inform monarch conservation. So I just want to end by saying that our efforts will be worthwhile. What we do for monarchs will help a lot of species besides monarchs. Monarchs exist in this incredible mosaic of rare and pristine habitats like native prairies or common and disturbed habitats. You might see milkweed growing up between the cracks in your sidewalk, and monarchs can find and use those milkweed plants. They're an incredibly interesting organism that we still have a lot to learn from, and their migration is an unmatched biological phenomenon. So my last slide is a picture of all of the organizations that have joined the Monarch joint venture that produced the handouts that I sent for your packets. We have a lot of people working together, working very hard for monarch conservation, and this is what gives me hope, that so many people are working on this problem. Thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Karen. Dr. Vera Krushik is a tenured associate professor in the Faculty of Entomology Department at the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resources Sciences at the University of Minnesota. Vera and I have worked together for years. When I used to work at the State Agriculture Department, we would go on the tour around the state to pesticide applicators and teach programs on pesticide applicator safety, but also pollinators, even way back a long time ago. And she also has about 3 paragraphs here on all of her accomplishments. She is a great asset as well to the state and a wonderful researcher, and she is going to talk about her work. Thank you, Vera.
I think I'll start
Just
with this
about,
ad lib here.
Yep.
Thank you, Representative Hansen, and the representative and senators who've joined together to make this possible, and the citizens of Minnesota who have an interest in pollinators. So I have pictures of myself as a kid my parents took, wearing diapers and holding bugs with braids on my head and smiling. So bugs have been with me for my whole life, and so I'm really happy that people are accepting them and wanting to preserve them. So I want to just step back a minute and say, where did bugs come from? Why are they here, and why are they important? And they're very important to us for managing pest insects. So if we go back to the Silurian, 350 million years ago, the first insects that came out of the water were shrimp-like animals, and their gills moved to the top of their thorax and became wings. And about 150 million years ago, when the gymnosperms, the pines and the cycads, had already been developed, they didn't need pollinators. But insects were already out there. Beetle species were already out there. Many, many different orders of insects were out there. And they started to direct the evolution of something new, which we call the flowering plants, the angiosperms. And so from day one, 150 million years ago, that pollen and nectar in a flower only evolved to feed insects. And it's a perfect thing. The flower makes pollen, which is protein, just like a hamburger. It makes nectar, which is sugar, like a Coke. And so an insect goes there and feeds on that. It helps female insects develop their reproductive systems. It sustains them. It gives them energy so they don't die. So I study insecticides and the effects on good bugs and bad bugs. And we've been using a lot of insecticides since World War II to take care of crops, because we have higher needs, we have more people, we have different perceptions about land use. And so one of the things that is going on is that those plants, those flowering plants that Karen talked to you about, are decreasing and they're disappearing. And we have a lot of ornamentals, but a lot of those ornamentals have been bred to be sterile. They don't produce pollen nectar. Every time you see a zinnia with a lot of flowers in it, you don't see any yellow. That means that that is a modified, the male parts, the stamens, have been modified into petals. And it doesn't produce nectar or pollen. So most of our garden plants through time have lost the ability to produce pollen and nectar, and so they're not insect food. So again, why do we need insects? You probably think of mosquitoes or cockroaches, but 99% of all insects need pollen and nectar as adults. Even mosquito females will feed on pollen or nectar. So the problem we have right now is we've decoupled 150 million years of evolution by removing the flowering plants that insects need and by putting in instead cultivars that don't provide pollen and nectar. So if we want to try to maintain balance in our ecosystems, reduce the outbreak of forest insects, reduce the outbreaks of agricultural pests, we need to maintain these good bugs. And as Karen was talking about, we somehow have to retrofit environments with plants that can provide this pollen and nectar. So as I said, I work on systemic insecticides. And what a systemic insecticide does is you spray it on a plant and it gets taken up by the plant and it gets expressed in the pollen and nectar. So we all know about systemics. All herbicides are systemic. You spray it on a Canadian thistle, it dies. There are many herbicides. There's 27 different ways the different modes of actions of different kinds of herbicides that kill that plant, okay? So they've been out there for a long time, but we haven't had systemic insecticides. So when these were proposed and when the chemical companies started to develop them, everyone thought, isn't this great? We're not going to have drift from spray. We're not going to have insects being killed because they have spray going over them in ag field. The chemical is going to be deployed into the plant to control the pest insect. However, somebody forgot about if it gets into the leaves, why can't it get into pollen and nectar? And so I started this research back in 1998, worked with what it was then called the Como Conservatory. And what we did was we bagged plants and we put little ladybird beetles in there after they treated it with systemic insecticides. So my first paper showed that when a plant is treated with a systemic insecticide, those little ladybird beetles, those 99% of the good bugs out there that need pollen and nectar, would feed on those plants and die. So if they fed on it a lot, if it was a sunflower that was rich in nectar and pollen, they liked it, they would die. If it was a variety of a plant they didn't like the pollen and nectar from, like a chrysanthemum, because there wasn't a lot, they wouldn't die, but they would be disoriented. They would walk and trip, and they would just sit there. So that is the difference between, in toxicology, when you study insects, when you study pesticides, is a lethal effect which kills an insect and a sublethal effect. And so most of the arguments on these neonicotinoid insecticides are not about the lethal effects, they're about the sublethal effects. So when EPA registers chemicals, they register them for an LD50, the lethal dose to 50% of the population to kill it. They don't look at the sublethal doses. So now they've got new protocols and they're going to start to do that. But remember, the first neonicotinoid was registered in 2000. We have 5 of them out there now. And they're all systemic. They all get put into the soil, sprayed on the side of a tree, and they get deployed into pollen and nectar. And so the argument is always, well, how much? You know, you heard that old story, if you drink 1 cup of coffee, you're fine. You need to drink 20,000 to be killed. Well, it's the same thing with insects. How many do they need? How much parts per billion do they need to be killed or have their behavior affected? So why don't you take out my handout? So I gave you a handout of my slideshow, but also a handout. I always feel my job is to present data. I'm a scientist, I do experiments. I'm not here to advocate just simply because of my personal beliefs. I'm here to share my data with you. And so it may be too data rich for you, but bear with me, I'm going to walk you through it. So I have a handout. What color is it? Somebody found? Blue. Yeah, blue. Blue is the slideshow. What color is the handout's yellow? Yellow. So get the yellow one. No, I think I'm fine. Thanks, Karen. I think I'm okay. So if you go through the first part of it, it's basically explaining the story to you. And so here's the story. In agriculture, on a corn seed, we use 1.6 milligrams of imidacloprid or thiamethoxam. And I'm just going to talk to you about imidacloprid to make this easy. There's 5 different kinds of neonicotinoids that are systemic, but it's the yellow one, guys. It's the yellow one. I feel like I'm in my college class teaching. So 1.6 parts per billion is put on the seed. Now, do you know that 1 part per billion kills a songbird? 1 part per billion. So 1 corn seed will kill a songbird. So luckily, Julie Ponder from the Raptor Center, her LCCMR was funded, and so we're going to hear about that more over the years. So 1.6 milligrams on a corn seed. When you use a big agricultural machine and you apply imidacloprid to a potato field, you're using 4 milligrams per square foot of soil. When I treat a nursery plant, I can use 300 milligrams per square foot of soil. When you treat a tree, a basswood tree, a linden tree, to keep Japanese beetles off of it, you can use 14 grams. So that's 14 grams, 14,000 milligrams on that tree. And I was going to show you some data I have on how much is expressed in pollen and nectar. If you have a tree that is bigger, it's 28 grams. Again, we're talking about 1.6 milligrams, 1,000 times less. That's on a corn seed compared to an application to a tree. So nobody ever sorted this out. I can't show you any graph that talks about the amount of imidacloprid you add to an annual or a perennial plant or a tree and how much ends up in pollen and nectar. That's a black box. We don't know it. So what I've been doing, trying to go piece by piece, is trying to sort this out to you. So this is what I can tell you from my work. 300 milligrams, the rate that's approved for greenhouse, when you put it into a plant, from that, you get 6,000 parts per billion in a herbaceous plant. 6,000. You only need 185 to kill a bee. You only need 10 parts per billion to affect their behavior. All right? Bayer itself, let's go with Bayer itself's criteria. 20 parts per billion is the NOEC, the non-effective concentration. They themselves agree 185 parts per billion will kill a bear outright. So in a herbaceous plant, from a greenhouse application, I get 6,000. So if somebody's good at math, what is that? 300 times more or something? All right, in that linden tree, there has been documentations both in Oregon, and then I go through the EPA database. In Delaware, they treated trees back in 2009 for a Japanese beetle, basswood trees. They treated them 2 years in a row, and all of a sudden they got thousands of bumblebees died. Bayer came out, the EPA came out, because this is called an incident, and regulation of pesticides or deregulations is based on these incidents. And so they found out that the bumblebees had 176 parts per billion in them. And we already said 185 is what kills them. So on your handout, there's 2 tables. One table tells you the parts per billion that affect the sublethal effects of honeybees and bumblebees, how they navigate, how they forage. The table before that, I believe, gives you all the papers that have residue and tell you how many parts per billion are in the pollen or the nectar from an application. And so my job, as I said, is to bring this scientific information to you to look at. You make a decision whether you think it's important or not. But basically, I'm telling you that the seed treatments, the 7.6 parts per billion that's been found in canola pollen, that's the maximum amount, that has never been shown to kill honeybees, okay? But that is the lowest possible dose. That was 1.6 part per billion. When we talk about the tree rate, when we talk about the greenhouse rate, it's much higher, and so you end up with much more. So again, we have our lethal effects and sublethal effects. So I hope that table, you spend some time looking through it with the different bee species, the different papers, and you understand that we are arguing about sublethal and lethal effects. So one of the things that happens in this whole argument, do neonicotinoid insecticides affect pollinators in general? The whole argument comes out, well, we've done 7 studies, it's true, 7 studies, whole colony studies with honeybees, putting them out next to fields with imidacloprid treated seed, and we haven't seen an effect. It's true. But it is not true with bumblebee colonies. And I'm going to show you some pretty slides now and explain why. All right, so this is a honeybee colony, and it's called a frame, and you put these movable wooden frames in, and the bees take care of their brood, their larvae, and out of those hexagonal cells, you get larvae that are fed by the workers. It's uncapped. When they change to an adult, they cap them. And then you have some cells with honey, and then you have propolis, which is an antioxidant. And so when you look at it and I look at it, if you look naively, it looks very irregular, but it is very regular. And so all the data has shown so far on these seed treatments, when you have this 1.6 part per billion on a seed, that is not affecting the colony. And so people say, well, it's so different with bumblebees, why? So this is what it ends up. When bees eat nectar or pollen, they feed on it, and they have a hypopharyngeal gland that helps detoxify the chemicals. Plus, the last stage in a bee's life is it's a forager. There are beekeepers here, so this is Vera's version of bees, so don't get too upset here. So when bees, the last stage in their life, they become foragers. And so if they have some sublethal effect from a neonicotinoid, they don't find their way home. There is a whole assembly of bees coming down. So a lot of times you can get that chemical is detoxified because of the way bees take food in, and they basically detoxify it themselves. And so you have to look at what's stored in the nectar inside the colony to actually figure out, is there enough in there to affect the brood? So bees, honeybees, have this system. And so it is not surprising to me that of the 6 or 7 studies that looked at the effects of seed treatments, this 1.6 parts per billion on a corn seed or a canola seed, does it affect honeybees? The data isn't there yet. But if somebody does a lab study, it's very easy to see these sublethal effects. So right now we have variants. We have lab studies, we have field studies. We're showing no effect in the field. If you do a lab study, you can show effects on behavior. And so what does this do? This allows everyone to argue about everything because it's now variance. Science is full of variance. It's our job as scientists to find the principle. So I've given you a principle. Honeybees intrinsically, because they're perennial colonies, because they detoxify their food, and because the last stage in the worker's life, they go foraging, they can deal better with these xenobiotics. Now, I use the word xenobiotic. Why? Because if we go back to our evolution of plants, when they started to evolve, they started to put chemicals in their foliage, which ends up in their nectar and pollen, to prevent insects from feeding on them. We call that coevolution. And so insects had to deal with that. Bees have to deal with them. So they have a natural detoxification system at multiple levels, at the genetic level, at the pharyngeal level, and we've talked about the hypopharyngeal glands. All right, so let's find some bumblebee pictures. There you go. So honeybees are managed bees. We need them, we love them, but we also have all these native insects that co-evolved with prairie plants. They need nectar and pollen, and their life history is very different. They don't have perennial colonies. They have annual colonies. That female bumblebee in the spring and fall is out there foraging. So she comes across something above 20 parts per billion. Again, bear itself, that's their criteria. She's going to get disoriented. She cannot figure out how to overwinter. She cannot figure out how to stuff pollen on her legs. Paper after paper talks about different mechanisms of this disorientation. They don't have the same hypopharyngeal glands. They do things completely different. And so that queen is exposed in the honeybee colonies. In the bumblebee colonies. In the honeybee colonies, that queen is never exposed. So I've given you 3 mechanisms here why honeybees and bumblebees deal with xenobiotics, pesticides included, differently. Let's go over it. Honeybees have perennial colony. The queen is sequestered. She never goes out and foraging. The last stage in the worker's life is their foragers, so if we lose some, it doesn't matter. And they detoxify their food. I guess that's 4. Bumblebees, they're annual. The female is out there spring and fall, flying around. If she comes across more than 20 parts per billion in some plant, she is going to have disorientation. and she may not be able to overwinter, and if she can't overwinter, it's all over. So it is not a surprise, if we go back to your handout, that most of the data showing there is effects of systemic and neonicotinoid insecticides are coming from the native bees, the bumblebees, because of this very difference in life cycle. So here's your bumblebee colony. So the difference that you see is they put the nectar and pollen inside the cell and they cap it. They don't feed it. About 6 eggs are put in each one of those. There are multiple queens in here. The queens start to be produced after about 5 weeks. They don't lay eggs in that colony. They're just fattening up to make as many eggs as they can, make as many ovarioles so they can make eggs the next spring. And you have only about 30 workers. So what is different? So those 30 workers, maybe every 3 weeks there's a turnover of 50% compared to 50,000 bees, honeybees. So those 30 workers, if they find a patch of high neonicotinoid plants, it's going to affect them much more than the honeybees, right? Because if you lose those 30 workers, half of those, that's the difference between the 50,000 honeybees, which again I told you at the end of their life cycle they forage, and the bumblebee workers forage throughout their whole life cycle. So I hope I have convinced you that just because the data is variant, I as a scientist can go through and give you information to sort through it so there still is an issue. But many people will take that information and say, look, it's apples and oranges, there's no issue. I call that disinformation. When people do not look at the data in a rational way and be able to set it into its components and tell you the story that I've just told you. So the next part of this, I just want to do 2 more quick parts. I'm almost out of time. So if you can go. Okay, so this is just a summary of what we talked about. The amount on a corn or canola seed, 1.6, 1.1 milligram. The amount on an ag field, 4 milligrams per square foot. The amount on a greenhouse pot, 300 milligrams. 14 grams on a 10-inch DBH tree. 28 grams on a 20-inch DBH tree. Okay, so now I've gone through the effects on the bees. You have the handout. I want to now just give you 2 little residue stories. So this is some of my LCCMR data. I'm really happy that I've been supported so I can gather this data for you. It's a little complex, but I'm going to go up in front of it and walk you through it. So remember I said on a 10-inch DBH tree, diameter breast height, I can put a whole 14 grams, not milligrams, if you need it. So if I apply that in June or in May, the first year, I get 33 parts per billion in the flowers. Now remember we said 20 parts per affect navigation. It's not going to kill the bumblebees. Probably won't even touch a honeybee, but it's going to affect their navigation of those 30 little workers who have to get all that food back to the queen and larvae. In the foliage, there's 15,000 parts per billion. 15,000. In the soil, the first year, what I can detect is 554 parts per billion. I hope I'm reading my own slide. Okay. So I'm sorry, I got it wrong. This is the soil. There's 15,000 parts per billion in the soil. So what do you think when you grow something under that plant? What's going to happen? It's going to take it up. Right. And then in the leaves, there's 554. If I go in August, the same year, what I see in the leaves went from 554 here to 1,000. They double. And the 33, I can't measure flowers in August. All right? So it went down in the soil, it went up higher in the leaves. If we get the next year up there, now the next year, we have 80 parts per billion in the nectar. So now we're getting up there. You need 185, 176 there itself to kill a bumblebee. Now look what's happening in the soil. We've gone from 5,000 to 1,700. We've lost about, 1/3. The leaves have gone down from 1,000 to 737. And then if we look at this now in August, again, no flowers, and I don't have all the data yet, you go down in the leaves half, and then you should reapply. So so when you reapply it, you never go down to zero, it's cumulative. So this is just, there is on some labels now, there was a voluntary exclusion of basswood and linden trees because their favorite bee plants, basswood honey, linden honey is a big thing for beekeepers. But not every label has it. Of the 10 imidacloprid labels for trees, only a few have it. So, I want to just summarize this. The dose makes the poison. Get back to our coffee analogy. 5 cups of coffee, not going to kill you. Whatever they say, 10,000 cups of coffee will kill you. It's the same thing when we do with plants. When we use a seed treatment, 1.6 milligrams. When you use it on greenhouse plants or trees, you're putting much more in, so you're getting more in the soil, more in the trees, more in the nectar. And again, I tried to explain to you honeybees and bumblebees have different biologies, and so the neonicotinoids affect them differently. I started out by talking about my work at the Como Conservatory, that this affects lady beetles. So I've shown that greenhouse applications affect monarch butterfly larvae, lacewings, wasps, 3 species of ladybird beetles, and a parasitoid that kills pest insects. So I ask you to read over our handouts today, assimilate what we're trying to say to you, that science always has a lot of variant data. We do statistics to try to make patterns. But I think there is pattern, and I think that higher rates of neonicotinoid insecticides will cause problems for not just honeybees and not just bumblebees, but based on my research for our good bugs and for our bad bugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Often when we think of zoos, you know, at the Minnesota Zoo, we think about the tigers or exotic animals. And we have exotic animals that are very small in Minnesota. And so Dr. Eric Runquist has managed the Prairie Butterfly Conservation Program at the Minnesota Zoo since its inception in 2012. And our zoo is doing amazing things, and Eric is going to talk about those. I would ask that you speak into the mic if you're going to be outside so that the folks at home can watch, can hear you clearly. So, Eric.
Thank you, Representative. And thank you, legislators. If you will, as we're getting my talk all loaded up here, I don't see it on the screen right now, but yeah, so I'm really happy to be here. This is a terrific audience and a terrific venue. Our contribution to our packet tonight are these 2 pamphlets that we've produced thanks to the LCCMR Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund money, so thank you for those. Trying to get to know the butterflies in your backyard and then the butterflies and what you can be doing in your backyard to helping pollinators. As we say at the Minnesota Zoo, we are for the big and the small. Our primary emphasis is to save wildlife, to connect people, animals in the natural world to save wildlife, and that doesn't matter what kind of wildlife it is or where it lives. And so we really want to be able to emphasize what we're doing now locally here. And so the primary emphasis that we're working on right now are not just the small butterflies or the big tigers, but or the bees. It's really all of the above. And I'm going to try to tell you the story of a couple butterflies that were in our own Minnesota backyards in the greater state of Minnesota and are now largely disappeared. And these are, yep, that one. Prairie butterfly, the one you've got highlighted right there. Thank you. And I'll say next whenever you can. Thank you. So, saving Minnesota's prairie butterflies. Let's go ahead and do it. So we can go next. So as we say, yeah, we are for the big and the small. You can learn more about our conservation programs at our website. And we work all the way around the world, saving endangered species at the zoo, but also on the ground and in many different programs. Next. And again, the big and the small. These small little butterflies are probably ones you've never heard of. These are one of those skippers that Karen alluded to earlier. These are Dakota skippers. They were just added to the U.S. threatened species list last October, and they are classified as a Minnesota endangered species. I'm going to tell more of their story and some of the other species they depend upon. Next. These are prairie butterflies, and prairie is really a defining feature of the state of Minnesota. It once covered about a third of the state of Minnesota in tremendously rich ecosystems, not only in the above ground plant diversity and the wildlife that depended on them, like the bison that were roamed across the state, which we are now working with Minnesota DNR to reintroduce back into state parks and as part of cooperative breeding programs, but also the below ground component of these prairies and the rich roots and the very complex ecosystems they performed. So next. The problem is though that most of that is gone. So historically in yellow we had the western third and the southern third of the state were prairie, but only 1% of that is remaining. This has now largely been converted for massive crop agriculture. So these little fragments in red on your screen are the last little pieces. So about 1% of that left. And that's a real big problem for those animals that can't get around and those plants that can't get around. So monarchs have the ability to migrate across all these vast get 15, 20 miles down the road to the next piece of prairie. The little butterflies that we're going to talk about today just do not have that ability. Next. And one of the things we're trying to do is understand why these butterflies are disappearing. Many species of butterflies in the state of Minnesota are disappearing, and they're indicators of the health of these prairies because butterflies are apparent, as Karen talked about. We can grasp onto them and look at them and use them because they have these complex life cycles and they're charismatic at the same time. So as butterflies are disappearing from the prairies, it can tell us things that may not be obviously apparent to us at the same time. This spot right here was actually a former site that held Dakota skippers just a few decades ago, but now has disappeared, and we don't know why. We are currently working at the Minnesota Zoo and partnering with the Fish and Wildlife Service. I think there's a next on that. To try to understand why they are disappearing. And in addition to monarchs disappearing, some of that could be the application of pesticides. We don't have the obvious reason for it. In many cases, like these small butterflies, like the skippers, it could be loss of quality habitat in terms of invasive species. It could be overuse of fire to maintain prairie characteristics. It could be underuse of fire. It could be many interacting factors at the same time. It could be climate. Next. So we want to talk about the other disappearing butterflies. And again, this big guy here is really actually kind of a small butterfly. It's the Dakota skipper. But in the state of Minnesota, we've got 15 species that are on the state endangered, threatened, or special concern list. Monarchs are not on this because they're still in okay shape. Declining, but in okay shape relatively to all these guys. And of these 15, 10 are prairie butterflies. So they depend on those disappearing prairies. Next. So the Dakota skipper, I want to tell you a little about it. So again, it was just added to the U.S. threatened species list, and it's an endangered species in the state of Minnesota. And we need to credit Joel Sartori, who's a photographer with the National Geographic, who has gone around to zoos all around the world photographing endangered species in this very bleak, dark photo arc sense to just capture an endangered species by itself and help tell its story as the animal. Next. And he came out to the Minnesota Zoo and photographed some of our animals. Historically, the Dakota skipper ranged across all these sort of yellow areas, we think, historically, stretching up from southern Canada down even old records near Chicago. But the vast majority of it was in the tallgrass prairie in western Minnesota and the Dakotas. And all those red dots are things where they were there, but now they're gone. We don't see them anymore. Next. And in fact, all that we know of in the state of Minnesota is that little spot right there, that little green dot. And if you can't see that, that's part of the problem because these are tiny little populations in tiny little places. And so they're increasingly fragmented. And so we only may have 1 or 2 populations left in the state. Next. We think they're gone from the southern part of the range. Next. Then the Poweshiek skipperling. This one, if you remember any butterfly in the world, besides the monarch, or the Dakota skipper, this one is one that's got the most powerful story. This was just added to the U.S. endangered species list, so even more trouble than Dakota skippers. It's an endangered species in the state of Minnesota. Cute, fuzzy, I think it's a really adorable butterfly. Next. Historically, it had a pretty similar range, slightly shifted to the east. There's populations in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Manitoba. That's all that's left. Next. We think it's gone from 95 to 96% of its range. Next. So all of these states where it was the majority of its range, including Minnesota, which had half of the historic range, hasn't been seen in many years, probably 7 to 8 years now in a row, despite intensive work at all those last sites. So this is a dramatically endangered butterfly. There are fewer than 150 seen in the world at all of these sites in the last couple of years. Tremendously endangered. There are 1,600 giant pandas in the wild, maybe 500 power-chic skipperlings, and these were in our backyard. Next. So just to compare with another endangered species that we do have at the Minnesota Zoo, the Hawaiian monk seals, and thank you legislators for building the facilities for that. There are 1,100 of these in the wild. And so this is the most endangered mammal in North American waters. They're entirely in North American waters. Power-chic skipperlings are entirely in our backyard, or at least they were historically. Next. So as Representative Hansen alluded to, in 2012, we worked with many partners and launched the Prairie Butterfly Conservation Program. Next. And this is now a truly international effort. We're working across the borders in the US and in Canada with tribes. And thank you again for the tremendous support from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and historic funding from the Legacy Amendment. And now AZA and Aveda and a bunch of private partnerships. Next. And so what we do is then we go out into the wild and we're working to establish conservation populations and then get them back out in the wild in the first place. Next. So we find females in the wild, we take them, we put them into little cups, next, inside a hotel room and take nice care of them. And this is a hotel room in South Dakota, it's low tech, but right there you can barely see it, but that's a female and she's laying eggs in that cup. We hold on to her for a couple days, next, and then we put her back out in the wild where we got her and then take those eggs back to the zoo to start that insurance and the backup population. Next. And these are the smallest animals we want to take care of at the zoo, I promise you. So at the top there are the eggs of power-chic skipperlings, and if you can make it out, that's the face of Abe Lincoln on a penny. Right there, that's his big nose. It's bigger than a power-chic skipperling egg on a penny. And here's a Dakota skipper on the bottom hatching out. So that's just a few hours after hatching. Next. Then, here's your baby, a cute, adorable baby photo. This is a Dakota skipper caterpillar, about 7 months old at this point, 7, 8 months old. And we rear them all the way through to adulthood. Next. And we get them to breed, yay. And that's what we really want to be doing, is be able to then produce new generations. And we've actually gone through a very intensive workshop program over the last couple days of deciding the actual formal program that's going to be going on. We are writing the book on how to raise these highly endangered Minnesota butterflies. And now we have a plan to start getting them back out in the wild. Next. So again, we want to be getting them out in the wild, and we want to be using them as also tools to learn about what's going on in the wild. Next. And so at the Minnesota Zoo, we can utilize our source as a primary education agency too. Next. And so we've replanted some of our parking lots and the little grassy knolls around the parking lots with prairie plants, and then we throw in a bunch of educational pieces about that. So telling the story of Dakota skippers and power-chic skipperlings and the bison and the entire landscape they depend upon. Next. And we're also tremendously good at education, and in the audience tonight is my tremendously hard co-worker, Cale Nordmeyer, and last Halloween he dressed up as a Dakota skipper to tell their story and get the word out. He could have chosen a monarch, but he chose the Dakota skipper, so thank you, Cale. And look for him again this Halloween, apparently. Next. We also have this Plant for Pollinators page we built, and that's modeled after one of the pamphlets I've got for you now, so feel free to check that out. Next. So those are things you can be doing in your own backyard with planting for pollinators, but then you can also be helping these butterflies in the wild and all the other wildlife that depends on them by supporting the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan. It's a multi-decade effort with many agencies, including DNR and Nature Conservancy and especially private landowners and stakeholders to work on reconnecting those dots of those little fragments of prairie and connecting the dots and being able to, restore at least a little bit of the historic prairie. Next. So we want those butterflies back out in the wild, serving as pollinators. Next. We want them mating and making new babies and new generations. Next. And we want them to be part of the food chain. And maybe it's a sad picture to be seeing an endangered species eaten by a crab spider out in the wilds. But I think this is actually a very happy picture, because it shows a Dakota skipper, an endangered species, out in the environment where it should be in the first place, interacting and being a member of that ecosystem that is now largely disappearing. So if that doesn't cheer you up next, that is all up to us then to encourage the new generation and grow from the bottom up to encourage prairie conservation and to tell the story of these pollinators. So thank you.
So we'll take a few questions. Nobody filled out the cards, I don't think. So maybe just a couple, raise your hand if you have any questions, and for the science panel. The question was, is there an approved company that is putting together the seeds together that people could use that are not treated or that are?
That would help facilitate. So if you had a couple hundred acres or 5 acres, or how do you know which mix to use and where to use them?
I'll just jump in right here, but I think there may be some additional speakers that are going to be maybe touching on this a little bit, but there are a good variety of native plant nurseries, and I think Department of Natural Resources has some categories on their page. I can't speak for them, but there are some out there, and so if somebody else is able to speak towards that in the future, or in additional talks, I think that might come up. It's a good question.
I'd just like to put in a plug. There's a really great program that the Fish and Wildlife Service runs called the Partners for Fish and Wildlife. And you can work as a partner with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they'll help you do restorations, help you get the proper seed mixes, and actually help you carry out the process. So that's another resource if you have large acreage. Just Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. Each state has a one person in charge of that. The question is, are there success stories where particularly the state and a private landowner has worked together? I think our state partners, I mean, I know that there are such success stories, but I don't work for the state. Were you going to say anything? Greg, he's got that covered. That'll be in an upcoming talk by Greg.
Over here, there was a question.
Yes, I've seen in the garden catalogs species of Asclepias, the milkweed, that are from South America. They're annuals up here, but they're advertised and people are growing them. Is there any problem with growing these tropical type of milkweed? Does it confuse the butterflies?
So the species that you're talking about is called Asclepias curasavica. It's a tropical milkweed. There is some concern about growing that in the southern United States where it is a perennial. It doesn't die back every year. And the problem with it in the southern part of the United States, is that it's available during a time when milkweed would not be normally available. But if you put that in your garden up here, it's going to die in the winter and not come back. So it kind of depends on how you feel about, you know, how much of a native plant purist you are. We grow it in our greenhouse at the University of Minnesota, feed it to monarchs. They love it. So, you know, it's not a biological problem up here, but it isn't a native plant. So, you know, we would try to encourage native plants, but it's beautiful and it's kind of fun to have in your garden. So it's up to you.
No problem.
No, unless you live in Texas.
One more question.
I had a question for Dr. Christian regarding the use of sprays that people are putting all over their lawns and gardens. And in my neighborhood, which is about a half a mile north of the St. Paul campus, they're spraying those all over and they're full of neonics.
So I get a call every spring when they start spraying for mosquito abatement from this guy in northwest Minnesota, and he's a really big advocate for butterflies. And so what he does is he goes out and he covers all his host plants and all his nectar plants with plastic. And he says if he doesn't do that, the larvae will die. He's tested it. So there is a lot of programs out there, and Obviously, mosquito abatement is really important because of West Nile virus and encephalitis. So if that's what you're talking about, they're not using neonics in water. They use something biorational, but they do spray pyrethroids, which are going to affect all beneficial insects. So the neonics, most of the time they're not sprayed. They're put in the soil or put on the trunk of the tree. And there is a lot of use of it in homeowner products. So anybody who has a rose plant, that's what they're going to buy because it does work for Japanese beetles. So consumers have it available for them, and they are using it. I don't think the state or the county is spraying it, though, right? So it is very available to consumers, and they can use it. And so where I come from Long Island, New York. Sometimes people recognize my accent. And it has been banned there. Nassau and Suffolk County, the neonicotinoids were never registered for homeowner use ever. So since 2000, and they're still all banned there. And they were worried because they did a few tests and it was showing up in their aquifer. So Long Island is a sandbar. It has a beautiful aquifer of clean water for New Jersey, New York City. Sits on top of the salt water. And they had a big problem back in the 50s with DDT and its metabolite DDE getting in the aquifer. So that's why they made it so that you couldn't buy it there. It's not registered for consumer use. So the neonics are used mostly in backyards by consumers or lawn care services, yes. The good news is there are 2 new products out there, chlorothalonitropol and a new kind of bacteria that work really well on grubs. So I think eventually we are going to move to efficacious products which aren't neonics.
Well, thank you, and we're going to, let's have a hand for the panel there. Our next set of speakers are from our state agencies. And, when we're at the Capitol, we refer to a lot of acronyms. So we have DNR, MDA, and Bowser. And Bowser's the Board of Water and Soil Resources, not the former singer at Sha Na Na. But it works with your soil and water districts. Some of the questions that you had, we're going to hear some answers and some explanations from the state agencies. Our first speaker is from the Department of Natural Resources. Greg Huck is the Prairie Habitat Team Supervisor. He has received his MS and PhD from Kansas State University before arriving in Minnesota 13 years ago. After 8 years of teaching, he worked 2 years at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and came to the DNR 3 years ago as a prairie habitat biologist. In Minnesota, we have a lot of public lands. So just to give you kind of a shorthand, the DNR works with the public lands. Bowser works with the private lands, with the private landowners. And the Department of Ag works with the ag chemicals and works with both agencies, working on both private and public land with training with the university and providing the certification and the competency measurement for the applicators. So it's all interconnected. Like ecology, the agencies and the university work together. So we'll start with Greg.
Yeah, thank you for having me here tonight. What I'm going to try and do is kind of fly at the 30,000 foot level, give kind of a broader overview, especially of some of the DNR programs, as well as the use of state funds like the LaSard funds. And I think Dan and Kevin are going to get a little more detail, a little lower level. Just to knock off that one question, as far as where you can get help, you can get help in a lot of different places. The DNR has a private lands program. Karen mentioned that the Fish and Wildlife Service has a private lands program. All Fish and Wildlife Service wetland districts or refuges have a private lands biologist. Soil and water conservation districts, every county has one of those. There are a number of different places you can go for that sort of information. So all you need to do is look around a little bit and you will find it. First slide, please. Okay, so, wow, I can't even read that. Okay, yeah, so the DNR manages about 5.5 million acres of land across the state. As was just mentioned, If you work for the government, all you do is speak acronyms all day long, and nobody other than somebody else in the government understands your acronyms. We have state forests, we have wildlife management areas, aquatic management areas, scientific and natural areas, state parks, state trails, etc. I work for the wildlife section, so we primarily deal with wildlife management areas. Next. Okay, just mentioned public lands. We do have a lot of public lands in the state, but they are not in any way, shape, or form evenly distributed across the state. So if you go look up in the northwest corner, we've got a lot of national forest and state forest. And then as you move west and south, we have very, very little public lands. So what I've highlighted here in green are national forests, state forests, national wildlife refuges, waterfowl production areas, wildlife management areas, and hopefully you can see out there in the western third of the state, you have to kind of squint a little bit. They just look like little specks or freckles out there. It's just a whole bunch of little teeny tiny parcels of land when seen at this scale. Next. Okay, a couple years ago, several legislators, a couple of them might be in the audience here tonight, tried to and very successfully got some legislative language passed about pollinators. They worked very closely with myself and my supervisor at the time, Bob Welsh, also with the DNR, as well as many people at the universities and a couple of the other agencies. So here's the legislative language that came out a couple years ago. The commissioner, that's the commissioner of the DNR, shall develop best management practices and habitat restoration guidelines for pollinator habitat enhancement. And then I won't read through all of that. Part B there, prairie restorations conducted on state lands owned by the DNR or with state funds, outdoor heritage funds from the Lessard Council, must include an appropriate diversity of native species. And here's where, referring back to what Karen said earlier, pollinating plants throughout the growing season. If you look at a lot of our prairies, especially our restored prairies, they're full of color in July, August, and into September. You look at those same prairies in April, May, and June, and there's very, very little out there blooming. Unfortunately, that's when a lot of our pollinators need resources. So that's one thing that we've been working on. We haven't been really successful at it, but we're going to try to really ramp that up here in the next few years. Next. Okay, just a brief review. There's going to be a lot of overlap. Eric covered most of this stuff, most of this slide in the previous one. What I want to say there in that top bullet, 350 to 400 species of bees in Minnesota. We think about 1/3 of those are in prairies. Hundreds of species of butterflies and thousands of species of moths. We don't know. Every time we go out there to do a survey to see the same old species, we find new species. So they're especially among those moths. They're just popping up all over the place. Eric touched on our threatened, endangered, and candidate species. What I really want to emphasize here, though, and going back to the early flowers, is the range of life histories. As a wildlife guy, I'm used to dealing with birds. They all get here in May. They all lay eggs and set on their nests for the most part in late May and June. They all hatch their eggs, raise their young through July, and they're all out flying around by late July and August. With insects, everybody does things totally different. Okay? We have to talk about nesting habitat, egg-laying habitat. Among our native bees, about 70% of those are underground, although some will nest in grass, some will nest in woody debris. Each one has a species or a suite of species that they prefer. Everybody knows the monarch story and milkweeds. Phenologies. Phenology is a fancy word for saying when things emerge or when they bloom if you're talking about plants. Our insects are out there literally from snow melt in the spring to snowfall in autumn. Okay, we have a lot of different species out there doing a lot of different things all summer long. Next slide. Okay, what we want to really emphasize, again, we are a wildlife agency, and we have really evolved, all of the agencies, the DNR, the Fish and Wildlife Service, all of us. If you go back to the 50s, we raised things you could shoot at, pheasants, mallards, and deer. Okay, the last 20 years, we really are all about diversity. We're about songbirds, we're about plant diversity, we're about reptiles, we're about amphibians, etc. Just as Eric was saying with the zoo earlier. So what we would like to argue, and I will argue very strenuously, is what's good for bees, is good for monarchs, is good for game birds, is good for songbirds, is really good for all that other wildlife out there that we traditionally think of as a wildlife agencies. Okay, so we're not talking about a radical or dramatic shift of what DNR and our partner agencies and organizations are doing for our restoration and management practices. We just want to do a little bit more and do it a little bit better. Okay, so restorations, historically, go back again to the 40s and 50s, we'd plant brome. If you go back to the 1980s, the start of the CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, we would plant native grasses, primarily big bluestem, often in monoculture, and who knows where that seed came from. I can take you to some prairies up in Clay County, up by Fargo-Moorhead and Detroit Lakes, and you look and you say, yeah, that's a prairie, but it sure looks like southern Illinois. Northern Minnesota prairies should not make me feel like I'm in southern Illinois. We were doing those back in the 80s, and honestly, we didn't know what we were doing. We just thought grass was grass, flowers were flowers. Now we're going to, a lot of our restorations, we're getting 60 to 80 species of native forbs, or wildflowers, in our mixes. And we have a really strong emphasis on using local ecotype seed. So we're trying to get that seed from as close to as possible when we're doing a restoration, as opposed to bringing in seed from western Kansas, or southern Illinois, or Indiana, or someplace like that. The issues that we still have, because the late flowering species are very abundant, they're really easy to harvest. You just run a combine through the field or your prairie in late September. You can literally harvest tens of thousands of pounds of seed in an afternoon. Okay, some of that early spring stuff, you got to go out there and hand pick literally on your hands and knees. So it's really expensive, and there's not a lot of that seed out there. If you look at our current restorations, or our restorations that are just a few years old, we still do not have a lot of spring flowering plants in those restorations. So what our solutions are, and this is just a bare minimum, coming from that legislative language, we now have wording in the DNR's best management practices that we require a minimum of 3 early blooming, 3 mid-season blooming, and 3 late blooming species in our seed mixes. Like I said, we're quite often at 40, 60 to 80 species, but we really need to emphasize getting those early species in there for those insects that come out of the ground early in the summer. Okay, our best management practices. Kind of the 3 big things we do out there. I'm a prairie guy, so this is going to be a prairie-centric talk. Prescription burning, or prescribed burning. Don't burn everything. Okay, used to be in the past, if there was that area that didn't burn out there, you sent the new guy out there and he had to go burn out that little patch. It's fine to leave those little patches out there. We call them skips. You rotate your burns around. You burn the northwest corner this year, you burn the southeast corner next year, southwest corner the third year. Mowing and haying. Again, don't do the whole area. Always leave some standing vegetation out there. And then grazing. Grazing, something that's fairly new to Minnesota, much more common if you move just a little west of here. It is a very, very powerful land management tool, just like everything else. It can be used and abused. You can also do amazing things with cattle. My introduction, I did grad school 8 years at Kansas State University, and trust me, Manhattan, Kansas, there's a lot of cows around there. But you can do really, really good things both with fire and grazing and mowing. Okay, prairie ecology. In 30 seconds or less, this is my entire, back when I was teaching, this is an entire semester class on one slide. The 3 factors that control the diversity and productivity in the prairie are the weather, our floods and our droughts, fire and grazing. Okay. When we're talking about fire greatly and dramatically stimulates flowering. Okay, that's going to be increased pollen and nectar resources. However, if you burn the entire area, any of those insects that are overwintering above ground, you're going to lose. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to leave some unburned at each site. So there you can see in the picture on the left, we're doing a prescribed burn, but we mowed a fire break through the middle. We're going to burn off the left side, we're going to leave the right side standing. Okay, trust me, we know this pretty well. The insects are going to hatch out of the above ground wintering insects are going to hatch out of the right, and they're going to immediately go to the left because that's where everything's going to bloom this spring or this summer. Grazing. Grazers eat grass. 90% of their diet is grass. You remove a lot of the grass, it releases the competition for the forbs, and all of a sudden you have wildflowers galore. Again, you can abuse grazing, you can do amazing things with grazing. Okay. When you get that big flush of wildflowers, you're going to have a lot more density and diversity of wildflowers. That's going to be, again, more nectar resources for your wildlife. I did use a bison picture in there because the first question everybody's going to ask, are bison better than cattle? It's a complicated answer, but the answer is no. I can do really good things with cattle. I can do really bad things with bison. It's management, management, management. It's how intensely you graze, how long you graze out there. From a fencing and infrastructure, a nice herd of Angus works really well. Next. Okay, so managing for diversity. In the wildlife resource, we like to talk about stacking the benefits. Okay, so we're creating habitat out there for game birds and songbirds. That's what we've traditionally done. That habitat's also good for pollinators and invertebrates. Okay, then those ecosystem services of all that habitat. Water helps clean water. It helps crops in the adjacent landscapes, and it's a good form of outdoor recreation. Next. As we were developing these restoration guidelines and best management practices for our management, we had lots and lots of input from lots of different people. These are just a few of the different groups that helped us out or provided guidance through that process. And thank you, and I'll take a seat and answer questions later.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kevin Kavanaugh. Kevin, were you at that conference in Morris where we had to put up the bed sheet? I've been at some conferences teaching. Kevin used to be in Extension, now works at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and he's going to talk us a little bit about the pesticide program at the Department of Ag.
No, but I was at an extension meeting with Roger Becker, who is an extension weed scientist, and the wind was blowing quite strong in Lincoln County, and this is before PowerPoint. So the slide projector was mounted on a box, and as he proceeded through the slide projection, the slide projector started sinking into the box. So people were watching it like this. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I thought I'm with the Minnesota Department of Ag, as Representative Hansen mentioned, and I thought we'd go over some of the pollinator habitat efforts that the MDA has been doing for the last 2 years. Next. So in 2013, the Minnesota legislation passed a pollinator legislation directing, as you saw in the previous presentation, some of the DNR habitat BMPs, but also for the MDA to develop some BMPs and also look at some other things, such as doing a special registration review of neonicotinoids. And also, once these BMPs were developed, we'd be using those in educational programs for pesticide applicators and ag inspectors as part of their pesticide recertification training. Next. In that report, there was a lot of things that we looked at. I do have some examples of this pollinator report, but it was looking at some of the gaps that we had in pollinator habitat and addressing those, identifying those, and presenting that in the report, but also providing some ideas or proposals in that report to the legislature to have them look at some of these things as well. Next. Okay, it'd be easier if I stand out here. Okay. So part of the project in this pollinator report was to develop a public awareness campaign. So we, as I mentioned, we did some work in developing these best management practices for pollinator habitats. We had a we had an advisory work group that helped give us ideas and assemble the direction and how we wanted to develop these different work groups. Now, in your handouts, you got a insects for yards and garden best management practice. In the inside cover there lists the different diverse representation in these work groups. So some of those members are in this audience tonight. So I just wanted to point that out. There were a lot of different entities, agencies working in developing the pollinator report as well as these pollinator BMP brochures. So they were quite productive and a lot of good input from a lot of different representatives in those 3 different work groups. And I also like to mention that there was at least one beekeeper in those 3 different work groups, one for the insects, for yards and gardens, roadsides, rights-of-way, and ag landscapes. Part of this public awareness campaign started at the Minnesota State Fair in 2014, where we had the Commissioner of Ag and some of the legislators join us in the State Fair, where we had a kickoff announcing the importance to the public and how they can participate in pollinator awareness and the things that they could do to help pollinators across the state. Next. So here you see one of the insects for yards and garden BMP. This is the one that was handed out to you. Each of these 3 different brochures have the same reoccurring theme of how to create, improve, or reduce negative effects on pollinator habitat. So there's some individual things here like enjoy dandelions and clover, which relates to what you just heard previously. What's the first flower out in the spring? Dandelions. What should you do? Close your eyes, leave it alone, because that's what the bumblebees and other overwintering insects are looking for when they're coming out of hibernation. Let's go to the next slide. This is the BMP brochure for ag landscapes. This is directed toward rural owners, farmers, etc., and taking a different approach to some of the things that they can do on their land, such as putting in living snow fences on some of their production land where they can incorporate some of the pollinator plants in with the different shrubs or grasses that are catching the snow. So it doesn't all have to be just grasses. And there's spot treatment for maybe noxious weeds on some of these places. But a lot of farms have idle land in small little chunks around the farmstead or other pieces of property where they can consider putting in some pollinator plants or just let the milkweeds go in that area. I think the Science Museum, when they had the butterfly movie there, it showed a farmstead where there was a lot of wild plants and milkweeds in a piece of the property on a farmland, with the outside area being the production land. So it was an example of idle land near the production land that could be just left alone for pollinator habitat. Next. And this is the third brochure, Roadsides and Rights of Way. This is directed more for county highways, MnDOT, township officers, as well as private landowners and things that they can do on their roadsides, such as not doing any of the mowing before August 1st. Now, there are exceptions to that when they get permits to mow that before that. They work that out with their township officers or MnDOT. Also living snow fences, or as you mentioned earlier, maybe some periodic mowing of different sections of township roads and let them just, if there's flowering plants in them, leave them alone and kind of alternate their maintenance of those. Next. This is the other thing that in the 2013 pollinator legislation directed the Minnesota Department of Ag to conduct a special registration review of neonicotinoids. So this, we do have a criteria set in place on how we go about reviewing different pesticides. So we set this up, developed a scoping document of what we were going to do, released that for public comment for about 60 days to gather input from the public on what we should address or things that we should specifically look at. That then was incorporated into the final scoping document. So we've gone through this process. We're probably at step 5 now. I know the Department of Ag has received a lot of inquiries. When is the special registration review going to be released? So we're almost done. We did have a little bit of a delay here. Some of our senior scientists, a couple have left, so that slowed it down a little bit, but we've made great progress. So we do have to make some final reviews and edits with our advisory core work group, which is composed of some of the folks in this audience, but MPCA, DNR, MnDOT, U of M, to look at the whole document, provide some more edits or changes into that. Then they are presented to the commissioner for his final review on that. So we are hopeful that this should be released after the first of the year. Next. These are some of the things that were addressed in the special registration review, the background in chemistry, the federal and state product registrations, uses, some of the benefits, things along that line. But if we look at the bottom, it's very important to look at some of the Minnesota-specific data that was looked at, and also some of the potential opportunities for preventing unreasonable adverse effects on the pollinator. So this was also going to be addressed in the review. Next. So this is some pictures from the Minnesota State Fair in 2014. This is where we had our public awareness kickoff campaign for an urban audience. We created a situation where little kids could, or adults, could wear the little bee headbands and make a pollinator promise, such as, I'm going to plant more flowers, I'm going to put out more water, I'm going to learn how to love clover and dandelions in my lawn and not control those. And we had a lot of participants in there, and we worked and organized this, so it was very successful. Next. Using the MDA Facebook and tweet, we had over 11,700 followers on that. Following that, there you can see our commissioner and some of our Minnesota representatives that participated on this public awareness announcement at the State Fair. So it was very, very positive. Lots of people visited. So we continued that on to this year at the State Fair. Next. So you can see Commissioner of Ag, Dave Fredrickson, and Lieutenant Governor Tina Smith assisting some of the little ones there and filling out their pollinator promise. We also had some activities for kids where they could fill in different pollinator cutouts and then color them, and then they could be pasted on the wall. We also had places where people could make their pollinator promise and put it in kind of the honeycomb there on the wall. So there was a lot of activities as well as the picture cutouts. And we also dispersed a lot of pollinator seed packets, which were 9 different native species, pretty much adapted for any place across Minnesota. That was from Minnesota Seed Company. Next. So just to kind of show you the success of some of these outreach effects, especially with the brochures, you can see the numbers there. In the last two years, it's almost over 42,000 and still climbing. Very well received. In fact, when some of the MDA colleagues visit other states, they hear about the work that Minnesota is doing in regards to improving or protecting pollinators. So thanks to the Minnesota legislature and other agencies, the state of Minnesota, are making an impact across the United States with some of the work we're doing with pollinators. So it's very well received. Also, when we look at the pollinator seed packets that were distributed at the state fair last year and again this year, it's over 100,000 seed packets dispersed across Minnesota to many organizations, church groups, master gardeners, teachers, soil and water conservation district, Pheasants Forever, state parks, numerous garden clubs, etc. So very well received. I get a lot of feedback saying the kids, the adults, very excited about this. And it's really educating a large number about the importance of pollinators all across the state. Next. In our first phase, we looked at the urban audience. So this year, we looked at phase 2 of getting the message to rural landscape owners, farmers, etc., and what they could do in helping to promote pollinators. So we organized an outreach message delivery system, worked with getting some of these messages out, working with our advisory core work group on what would be the most effective message and how can we connect with the farmers or rural landowners so they can understand or appreciate the work that we're doing and what they can do, and also inviting some of them to install some of these pollinator habitats across the state. So we had many press release and media interviews. You can't see it in the small print there, but there were several stories or case stories where individuals from Todd County, organic farmer, from Southwest Minnesota, township officers, where they stepped forward and they made the effort to put in pollinator habitats on their land. And we also have a very large potato grower in Northwest Minnesota who's done the same thing. So the message is out there and it's growing little by little, so there's more and more people participating in this project all the time. Next. Some of the 2014 laws, there was a nursery plant labeling law, which pretty much said in effect that plant material cannot be marketed as pollinator friendly or beneficial if it's been treated with a systemic insecticide, or there's a couple other clauses in there, or if that product has a bee icon, which is a warning that that product is toxic. Well, most insecticides are toxic to bees, but it's a warning, or some other thing in the precautionary statements. So that was passed in 2014. This particular law is under, I should say, responsibility of a different division than I am. It's in the Plant Protection Division. So next. Also, the beekeeper compensation law was passed in 2014. This was directed at acute pesticide poisoning, where the poisoning from a pesticide is very acute, and in fact, rapid kill. So that's being very specific there. We developed a formal process and compensation was set up. We worked with an advisory group and established some of the protocols, how the investigation would be carried out, how it'd be sampled. We assembled bee experts from U of M, USDA, and other nonprofits and beekeepers to work in the investigation and how we would bring those to conclusion. Okay. Just as an example, in that legislation, the maximum compensation for any one individual beekeeper where it was found that there was a bee pesticide poisoning, acute pesticide poisoning, would be $20,000. So that's the maximum an individual could receive. They could receive more than one, but the minimum is 100, and the combined maximum would be $20,000 per individual. All right, next. The reimbursement change in this law was passed this year. So in order for the beekeeper to be eligible for compensation for an acute bee poisoning, they would have to be registered with a sensitive or pesticide registry program, which in Minnesota, the only one we had is called Driftwatch. And if you're not familiar with Driftwatch, it's a sensitive site registry. It's not owned by the Department of Ag. We are a participant in it, and it's owned by a nonprofit organization called Fieldwatch out of Indiana. And so people, you can participate voluntarily, and it's open for beekeepers, grape growers, honeybee producers as well. And you put your site on a map, and then applicators that participating can find out where that particular beehive is located. Now, there's one caveat that I have to, and I will during the summer, or during the winters, tell the applicators, the beekeepers also have the option of having that site hidden from the public viewing map. And the reason for that is they don't want other people seeing where their beehive is located, or they're worried about theft. Okay, next slide. And I'm done. So all the different agencies you're hearing from tonight are working in a sustained collaborative effort here in educating, improving the pollinator habitat, and none of us can do it by ourselves, so we need your help as well as the different agencies in improving the habitat across the state.
Thanks, Kevin. Dan Shaw is a vegetation specialist and landscape ecologist with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. He's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are available for landowners.
All right, it's nice to be with all of you tonight. So I'll be talking about the work that the Board of Water and Soil Resources is doing, also called Bowser. Next slide, please. So the mission of our agency is to improve and protect Minnesota's water and soil resources by working in partnerships with local organizations and private landowners. And so we're very focused on private lands. You may wonder, what does this have to do with pollinators? And I'll be getting to that part as we go along. Next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about our partnership and funding model. So our funding that our agency receives goes to local governments, and so that includes watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts, cities, counties, and others. And they're the ones working with private landowners and getting the money out to private landowners. And we'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. Next slide. With our projects, we have different goals that we're focused on. In some cases, it's water quality. Very common that water quality and soil conservation go together with projects. We also see the Wetland Conservation Act in Minnesota, and so we do wetland mitigation. And then wildlife habitat tends to be part of all of these project goals and projects that we're working on. Next slide. The picture down below here is a private lands, and so we have private lands easement programs where landowners sign up for these programs, and they have an easement where we do restoration work. This is a wetland restoration. You can see all of the flowers that are part of this site. And Greg talked about how we've transitioned over time where we focus a lot more on diversity now with conservation. And one of the benefits of having all these flowers here is that they're filling a niche where otherwise maybe thistles or other weeds might fill in there, but they're also providing a lot of pollinator habitat at the same time. There's also the new state buffer law in Minnesota, and so we'll be focusing on pollinators as part of that as well. And so that's another example where we're focused on water quality, soil conservation, and wildlife habitat. Next slide. So I mentioned the Wetland Conservation Act in Minnesota. This is a restored wetland, and these wet meadow communities that we restore can really be high quality pollinator habitat. We use diverse seed mixes that we've developed for the state, so whenever we're replacing lost wetlands, we're working on getting high diversity back into these sites. And so these can be really good opportunities to provide more pollinator habitat. Next slide. And so really, habitat is a part of all these projects that we're doing. And I'll talk about our pollinator initiative that we're doing with the state. And part of that initiative is to really get pollinator habitat into each of the project types that we're working on. Next slide. So this is the web page for our pollinator habitat. You should have this in your packet if you want to get to this web page. We have this pollinator toolbox, and there's different icons that you can click on this toolbox that focus on different topics: funding, planning, site preparation, all the way through to long-term management of projects. And so this is designed to assist landowners that are working on projects, and then there's a lot of links on this page as well. Next slide. So our pollinator initiative, some of the main goals are to increase awareness about declining pollinator populations, work pollinator habitat into all of our programs that we have, and provide technical assistance to people who are receiving our funding and landowners that are working on pollinator projects. And Greg mentioned the legislation that we have. Legislators have played a key role in this as well, making sure that there's legislation in place to get pollinator habitat out onto sites that are funded through state funding. Next slide. So these are some other key parts of our initiative. One is to focus on protecting pollinators from pesticides. I'll talk about pollinator corridors and the role of corridors in protecting from pesticides. Ensuring flower resources through the season, pollinator nesting sites, clean water sources, and then pollinator corridors. Next slide. We do work across the entire state, but I wanted to focus a little more attention on the Twin Cities metro area. And this is showing the metro area. You can see the Mississippi coming down and the Minnesota River coming in, and you kind of get a sense of where we might be located, actually with a red dot on the map there. And you can see that the green areas, those were wooded areas. Areas that tan, those were savannas, scattered oak trees with prairie plants. The lighter color is prairie. So there's a real diversity of habitats and a lot of area for pollinators, prime habitat. Next slide. So this is what's considered intact and left in the Twin Cities metro area. So you can see there's really not a lot that is left there. A lot of it is along the rivers where we do have more intact habitat. Next slide. And we really have a wide diversity of bee species, native bee species. There's around 450 roughly native bee species in the state. You can see in that picture some of the size differences between them. And the graphic that's shown here is showing that depending on size, quite often their flight distance will be different. So a really tiny sweat bee may be able to fly 300 meters, and a bumblebee maybe 900 meters. And so when we're thinking about creating habitat, we need to keep that in mind, that some of these bees really don't fly very far. Next slide. So these are some local efforts, Keller Lake and Lake Phelan. This is an area where there's a corridor being created. So some of our funding is being used along this corridor. And these types of areas in the metro can be really important because they're large areas of habitat. And so depending on the species of bee, there's probably some decent habitat in here. And these are, pretty large habitat areas where there's not pesticides being used. And so there's going to be safety from pesticides within some of these corridors. And you can see the picture on the left, all the milkweeds that are being planted along Lake Phelan, and those are going to benefit monarch butterflies and a lot of other species. Next slide. And then there's also lots of BMP projects happening. This is in the Ramsey, Washington Metro Watershed Districts area. You can see all of the BMP plantings that are going on. They have a cost share program. They actually still have money this year if anybody is interested, and it can be used for pollinator plantings. There's a 50% cost share for their program. So if you go to their website, you can find information about that. But the thing that's happening with all these dots is that there's lots of habitat, and the more dots we get on the map with these projects and landowner projects, the more bee species that will benefit because we're creating a lot of habitat close together. Next slide. These are some of the local projects, and you can see that there are a variety of project types. Lake shores, some wetland projects, there's rain gardens, they can play a key role. And so really there's a variety of project types that can be used to help pollinators and improve water quality and other benefits. Next slide. More pictures of some of these local projects. The one down below is at Lake Phelan. You can see a real diversity of flowers there. There's some liatris there. That's one of the better plants for nectar for monarchs. And so there's going to be a lot of good nectar sources in our site like that. Next slide. And then also the Soil and Water Conservation District. They have funding to do projects. These are some lakeshore projects that they're funding and working on, and those are going to be providing key habitat as well. Next slide. So I just want to focus on a few of the key benefits of these projects, and these are things that can be done by homeowners as well. One is getting a lot of different types of flowers out there so we get blooms through the season and we have high nectar sources for pollinators. Next slide. So some of the early blooming plants like golden alexanders, some of our shrubs, native shrubs play a key role early in the season before some of our prairie plants become active. And so plants like elderberry can play that key role because they're blooming early. A lot of our cherries bloom early as well. Next slide. We've talked about milkweeds, the importance of milkweeds. So there can be a lot of opportunities. We have a lot of different milkweeds in Minnesota. So there's a lot of different niches or areas where these milkweeds can be fit in. Next slide. Also high nectar sources. Giant hyssop on the right is one of my favorites, used by a lot of different pollinator species. And that meadow blazing star is the one that really draws in monarch butterflies, really rich nectar source for them as they're migrating. Sometimes you'll see like 10, 12 monarchs on that one species. Next slide, please. And then also fall species. As pollinators are going into fall, they need habitat, they need food sources so they can make it through the winter. And so our goldenrods, asters, things like Joe pieweed can play a pretty key role there. Next slide. Also, nesting sites is a need for pollinators. These corridors we were talking about can be really important nesting sites for pollinators. Some of them nest in stems. Joe pieweed is a good species where if the stems are standing for a year or so, they start to hollow out and they can be nesting sites. Some of the shrubs we were talking about can do that as well, like elderberry is a good example. They can hollow out inside and can be nesting sites. And our prairie grasses tend to be clump forming, so they have little gaps between them where ground nesting bees can get into those little gaps in there. So it's good to have a variety of different habitat within landscapes so we can get the nesting sites in there as well. Next slide. And then efficient foraging areas. There's some research showing that when you clump plants together, it's pretty efficient for pollinators. They don't have to search as much for plants. All the plants are right there. And so that is a pretty common technique for a lot of the projects that we do. We're clumping them together, partly for aesthetics and also for maintenance, because you can tell what's a weed and what is the native plant, but it's also a benefit for pollinators. And so that's a pretty common planting strategy that we use. Next slide. And then clean water sources. A lot of these projects are focused on clean water. That is another need of pollinators, is having clean water sources. So these rain gardens, these projects that we're doing in these landscapes have that added benefit of providing that clean water. Next slide. Next slide. And just a few final notes for next steps. We're focusing on finding new research or partnering with research because we always need more information about pollinators and how to benefit them. Building local partnerships is also going to be key moving ahead. Applying design strategies. We're trying to figure out how do we design plantings and projects to have the most benefits to pollinators. We still don't have all that figured out. That's another thing that we're working on. We are working on about 30 new state seed mixes for different purposes, and all of those will have pollinators as part of them, as part of a consideration for the development of those new mixes. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions for the agency panels, and then as we're doing that, maybe if they want to come up here, and we'll start with the questions. There are handouts and materials outside where you came in. Some of you I know came in this door, but there are some tables set up outside if you want to pick up some of the fact sheets and handouts and materials. So we're going to go right here first. Yes, yep.
This question is for Mr. Kavanaugh. First of all, thank you, everyone.
Well, the Department of Ag is responsible for controlling noxious weeds. So that is carried out by a lot of the local township supervisors across the county. And MnDOT is also controlling a lot of noxious weeds because that's part of their, it's a state law, so that they have to be managing those roadside areas, as well as ag inspectors are also working locally with township officers or county highway department and identifying those areas to control those noxious weeds. Unfortunately, the native pollinators and bees and other insects love them because they don't care about laws, they just care about flowers. But it
Have our habitat be pollinated. Some of these plants 30, 40 years from now that we're encouraging, that we used to discourage, are all of a sudden are they going to be a problem? Are we making decisions today that we're going to regret?
the future, the crystal ball.
I mean, like buckthorn, great.
Well, I'd like to see wild parsnip go away. Yeah, so that's another very serious invasive species. So it's hard to predict on some of these, because you're talking about all kinds of different plant species that are highly competitive with each other, and some of our speakers talked about that. So it's a very difficult question you present, but very real. I can't pinpoint anything for the future, but that's the best way I could approach that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Any projects that are funded through our agency need to use native plants kind of as a starting point. And so any projects that we'd be funding would be using native plants. And as a general rule, we encourage diversity for any of our projects. There may be some exceptions where if we think there will be a lot of pesticide drift or impact, that may be possible. That's where we may not promote diversity as much. But we're always promoting wider buffers if possible as well, more protection for pollinators. So generally, yes, wherever we can promote diversity for these buffers, we will be doing that.
So the question was, when will the special registration review document be released? And is there any possibility of restrictions on neonicotinoids? Correct? So as I said earlier, we've made great progress, so we're getting very near the end, so we anticipate the release of the document sometime after the first of the year. And as I said before, in that review and those working on it, there are opportunities for actions that could look at some of the what you had mentioned about maybe some restrictions or whatever, but that decision would be made by the Commissioner of Ag. So at this point, I don't know, but there is that possibility.
But you're involved in the recommendations, correct?
The researchers and the scientists working on that, yes, and there's others involved in that.
So are there recommendations for restrictions in it now?
I have not seen all of the document yet. Okay. So there's still more. Remember, there's an advisory group that's going to be looking at this, as well as, and some of those people are not in the MDA. So there's more than just the MDA looking at this document. And they're offering their edits, comments as well. And those will be incorporated into the final document.
Our next panel is maybe able to answer some of the questions about how policy occurs from a public perspective. We have some beekeepers and folks from the city here. Our first two speakers are Lex Horan, an organizer with the Pesticide Action Network, and Aaron Rupp, the executive director for Pollinate Minnesota. And as they're coming up, are you going to do this together? Or? Yep. Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin from Pollinate Minnesota. I started Pollinate Minnesota this January, where we do education and advocacy work around pollinators. And for the past 3 years, I had been incubating the programming that is now Pollinate Minnesota within Christy Allen's small business, A Bee's Knees. And she'll be talking more about that work after us. Yeah.
Hey everybody, it's good to be here. My name is Lex Horan, and I work with an organization called Pesticide Action Network. And we work here in Minnesota and nationally and internationally alongside different communities who are impacted by pesticide use to figure out how to change our food systems so that those harmful impacts aren't happening anymore. And so bees are one piece of our work that we do, and we love doing it here in Minnesota. So let's go to the next slide. So I think the place that Aaron and I want to start, we're talking about sort of the advocacy piece of this, right? And given everything that we've heard tonight so far, why is it important to have advocacy work be a part of the picture? And I think the first piece is, as we've heard tonight, there are these multiple effects that are coming together to cause pollinator decline, decline of honeybees and native pollinators. We know there are issues around habitat, around pesticides, around diseases and parasites. And the way I understand the science is that if we don't tackle all of those different factors, we're not going to be able to turn around the problem, right? And the reality is that right now we're seeing a lot of action around increasing habitat, a lot of great work to increase habitat across the state, important research happening to tackle issues around diseases and parasites, and we need to take on pesticides as well if we're really going to make this happen. And so we need advocacy work to move that forward. We also know that folks are doing everything that they can in their own backyards. They're planting pollinator-friendly plants, and we need changes at the policy level that are really going to change the landscape in a bigger way. We also know that our decision makers do the right thing when they hear from the public, right? And when they hear from the public with scientifically sound information and with our own personal stories about how these issues impact our lives. And I think anybody who's been here tonight is really well equipped to sit down and talk with your decision makers with the information you've heard tonight and talk about what is my concern about pollinators? How can I advocate around this issue? And, finally, I think we know that there are companies who produce pesticides who are speaking loud and clear about their interests in this matter, right? Who have a vested interest in seeing pesticides stay on the market. And the rest of us have a vested interest in a food system that is healthy and resilient. And we need to be speaking up just as loud and clear as the folks on the other side of the issue are. So we can jump to the next slide. This is you.
We're sharing the presentation. So folks are voting with their trowels and their dollars to plant more habitat in the, oh, sorry, I'm a shorty, on the lands that they manage. And one of the ways that this is happening is at smaller municipalities besides the state level. So one of the things that we're battling against as folks who want to limit bees' exposure and pollinators' exposure to pesticides is this law called preemption that's been on the books in most states since the late 80s. And preemption says that no municipality, no governing body smaller than the state can regulate pesticides any more stringently than the state does. So there's all these communities in Minneapolis nationally that are passing bee-friendly resolutions, and those resolutions are on the lands that those cities manage. The Pollinator Friendly Alliance is here. Some folks, do you want to wave? These folks were responsible for passing the resolution in Stillwater. Shorewood was the first community in Minnesota to pass a bee-friendly resolution. Minneapolis just passed one in August. We have three other communities, well, 5 total, that have said on the land that they own and manage that they're going to manage that in a pollinator-friendly way. This is something that isn't necessarily just a city thing, right? I've been talking with some school districts. There's precedent in college campuses. Anybody who has campuses that manages lands can make a pledge to do this good work for pollinators. And just like a really informal study of how much land we have as individuals in Minnesota, if you take like average landowners, like half an acre or less, I think all of us together own like 2% of the land. And that's not taking in large landowners or farms, right? But yeah, we need to be looking at the bigger landowners too. Next slide. So I named Pollinator Friendly Alliance. Humming for Bees is the group that worked in Shorewood. Pollinator Revival, Julia's in the audience too. There's a lot of us in town, the Bee's Knees, in this community doing this work all together. Yeah. Next slide. So why is it important? We heard all about this, right? From a beekeeper perspective, Pollinate Minnesota has 15 hives this year. I'll be lucky if I come out of the winter with 7. So that's based on our average as a state from this last year. We lost 50% of our hives in Minnesota over the last calendar year. Nationally, that's about 42%, so we're a little bit higher than the national average. And it's hard because Minnesota has been an awesome spot to be a pollinator historically, right? We heard from Karen and Eric about butterflies and their range here, about the amazing role that Minnesota and the upper Midwest plays in the monarch life cycle. And the same thing is true for honeybees and for beekeepers. It used to be the place where you brought your bees back to get healthy, to do the pollinating work that our food system requires of you. So, yeah, to lose that here is a big deal, and it's something that we all need to be fighting for policy change to support. And Minnesota is nationally unprecedented and had been with the kind of legislation that we had been working on, that we are still working on, and we need to continue that momentum because I'm a proud Minnesotan. I assume that a lot of you are too. Yeah, next slide. So some of my pictures didn't show up. This is like a cool one of me testifying that you can't see. But the 2 main areas that we're focusing on policy-wise are on this habitat creation. Dan talked about buffer strips. That's a key area. Roadsides are a key area. Both of these are things that we've identified because they can be regulated through state policy change. One question we have about those things is the amount of how much pesticide drifts. And there was a study that came out this past week from an oil rapeseed field and looking at the neonic level in the pollen of the wildflowers that border that field and the neonic level of the pollen in those oil rapeseed flowers, and found that the pollen in the wildflowers was the neonic in the pollen of the wildflowers was way higher. So that bodes pretty poorly in terms of us solving the problem through habitat creation. We need to be looking at pesticide policy too. And one thing that we're looking at in Minnesota is pesticide use reporting. Next slide. This is like way too much text, right? But the main thing to take out of that is that if we knew how much, as the public, if we knew how much pesticide was being applied by folks who are registered to apply that, we could use that data to then do more science like that we need. Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
No. Okay. Go on.
Well,
Still you.
Oh. Yes, and Kevin spoke to this, but the MDA has their neonic review. Kevin spoke about how people are calling him about when it's going to come out. We can keep calling him. Last I talked to the Department of Ag last week, it was November, December, the timeline. So let's keep up the pressure on them.
Oh, more text. So I'll talk a little bit too about what's happening nationally at this level. So we know that Minnesota is a leader in this work in the country, and that also means that there's quite a bit of back and forth, and there's a lot of fun tussling happening over state policy in Minnesota. Somebody mentioned this change to the nursery labeling law that happened, right? That was a modification, and really we see as a rollback of some good progress we made. It means we need to keep weighing in. But we also need change at the national level. So back in 2014, President Barack Obama made an announcement that he'd like to see a federal strategy to take on the issue of pollinator decline. So all the federal agencies got together to do a bunch of work to plan around that. That was called the White House Task Force. Some really important progress came out of that. If you've heard about the I-35 corridor with Monarch habitat, that came out of this initiative. And unfortunately, we didn't see the kind of movement on pesticides that we would have liked to see come out of that. We saw some small changes that are important. The Environmental Protection Agency is still in the midst of a review of neonicotinoids that's gotten sped up a little bit. It's supposed to be wrapped up by 2017. EPA has also announced that they're not going to register new neonicotinoids, likely, in the next coming years. All the ones that are already on the market are going to stay put for now. So to us, that's an issue. That's 500 plus products that are on the market now that aren't going anywhere, right? And it also doesn't affect other products that are very similar to neonicotinoids but are classified differently. So again, we need to make some progress on that. There's a bill in Congress called the Saving America's Pollinators Act that's calling for a suspension of neonicotinoid use. And then there was a recent court decision that's really relevant for our work and I think has really raised some interesting questions about a neonicotinoid called sulfoxaflor. The Ninth Circuit Court in California essentially said EPA approved this pesticide product without the correct process. It's causing a lot of harm to bees and it needs to come off the market. That's really relevant because it was approved by a process not very different from the other neonicotinoids. And so this throws up a lot of questions about the process by which those products came to market and what's going to happen next, right? Next slide, please. And so this is where we're going to end, right? What we're here to talk about today is the roles that everybody in this room can play in joining the movement to protect pollinators. First, as I already mentioned, we want folks to be talking with their decision makers. Sit down and have a cup of coffee, make a phone call, write a letter, include your own story and include the science on the issue and talk about why this matters to you. I hear all the time that the number of real personal phone calls and letters that folks get is actually relatively small. And if you really understand the issue and have something to say about it, please weigh in because it's important. There's also ways to build the conversation, right? Organize local events like this one in your community, write letters to the editor, elevate the conversation with high quality information. And finally, stay connected with other groups who are doing this work. We have a lot of eyes out there who are looking for opportunities to weigh in, so get connected with us as well. Next slide, please.
Oh, here's another picture one that's gone. But thank you to everyone who's hosted this forum, and they're right here. You can tell them how you feel. This website, if you search who represents me, you'll come up with who represents you, and their contact info. Yeah, next slide. And next slide. I do a lot of work with youth, so there's also honeybees, we learn about insects in second grade, right? Karen spoke to this. And insects are an amazing teaching tool that you can go outside of your classroom into your schoolyard and find somebody to teach with. So I do a lot of classes with people in beekeeping suits. Next slide. And if this is something that you want to do, let me know. Yeah. Thank you. Next slide. Oh, Lex, your info didn't show up.
Oh, it's there.
It's just where you, okay. Thank you for understanding about our formatting.
Cool.
Next, we'll hear from a couple beekeepers. Christy Lynn Allen is the founder and head beekeeper for the Bee's Knees. Christy.
I think I'm Erin's height, or close to. All right, is everybody still awake and interested in this? Good, yay, yay. So there's a lot of redundant information in my presentation about the legislation, but I'm here tonight to speak to you as a beekeeper who has been directly affected. In fact, my business has been impacted greatly by pesticides, by the legislation, and has really shaped the way that we are moving forward as beekeepers. Next slide, please. This is hard with the... my aunt and uncle are commercial beekeepers. They operate about 1,200 hives up near Deer River, Minnesota. So they're almost 4 hours north of the cities. And like I said, they're commercial beekeepers, so they do move their bees to the almonds every year for pollination. I don't know how many of you know about this event, but it's the biggest pollination event in the world. And a lot of commercial beekeepers go out there to bring their bees there because it pays their bills. And bees don't make as much honey as they used to, and so that income is threatened. When I first started working with my aunt and uncle, it would be 7 years ago now. The minute I stepped into a beehive, I was hooked, and I knew that's what I wanted to do for a living. But I didn't really want to take 1,200 beehives out to California and pollinate almonds, because as many of you may or may not know, that's a pretty unsustainable situation that beekeepers are in right now, and it's precarious and kind of scary. So, next slide. I was inspired by the bees, but also a social science background, and I am an avid cyclist, year-round cyclist in Minnesota. So my aunt asked if I would like to sell their honey in Minneapolis. I had an idea around Halloween. In fact, we're approaching the 5-year anniversary of the business the end of this month. And I dressed up like a bee, like a humble 30-year-old, and started delivering honey on bicycle. And the pun I like to use is it stuck, right? So people really liked seeing this giant bee biking around on the road. It drew attention to the bee issue, but also was good marketing, right? So we now are in most of the food co-ops in Minneapolis. We still do home deliveries. I was nostalgia. You probably, many of you remember the milkman. I was nostalgic for a time I didn't really live through, but I liked the idea of having this relationship with someone who brings you something you want to your door, and so hence the honey delivery. Next slide. In doing this work of honey delivering and drawing attention to the business in order to grow it, we noticed there was a lot of interest in bees and beekeeping. Bees were dying. Why are they dying? What is raw honey? What flowers do bees like? And what is a honeybee and what is a wasp? A lot of education was needed around the city. So I teamed up with Aaron, who you heard from, and we did an education program. We started putting hives in the city and did that program of educating people that is now Pollinate Minnesota for 3 years. And then we turned that into, as we grew our numbers of hives, zip code honey. So actually, I have hives not too far from here at the Minnesota Waldorf School in, I think it's a St. Paul address, but it's Maple. I'm confused about where it, yeah, okay. So they really wanted hives there, and so we label the honey by the zip code, represent the community that's supporting the hives through that honey, and they all taste very different, and it's a really great way to kind of educate about bees through the product that they produce. Next slide. So we also started a honey house, a community honey house. A honey house is what beekeepers call the place they extract honey. And being an avid cyclist, I was given a broken hand crank honey extractor and really wanted it to be pedal powered. So we did a Kickstarter campaign, and we also needed a space to operate, and we wanted a community space where hobby beekeepers could come and extract honey, and hence you have the Bees Knees Honey House. So we're in our 3rd year of serving people at the honey house, And I did the numbers before we came. Since we started, we've extracted over 10,000 pounds of honey by bicycle, which is pretty amazing. And my uncle would think is crazy, because why would you pedal it and not plug it in, to the wall? But we like to bike. So the other great thing about this space is it really does keep this community around bees strong. And it introduces beekeepers, which are of all forms of life, to each other, and talking about bees and eating lots of honey, and giving them a clean and nice space to extract their honey. We also this year started a program called Camp Bees Knees, focusing on educating beekeepers. We have an incredible resource, many incredible resources here for educating beekeepers, the University of Minnesota Bee Squad, but we wanted to do a very hands-on intensive course. So this is called Camp Bees Knees. We started it this year. We serve, we put about 11 hives in an apiary, and then we give everyone a hive to manage, and kind of guide them through the process. And really we're learning together, and there's a lot of different things that can happen in a beehive, and there's lots of external and internal things. So it's been really great, and we're furthering to strengthen this community of beekeepers and people who support bees. And also, there's a lot of interest in becoming a beekeeper, but some people may or may not be equipped to be a beekeeper. So instead of investing in the bees and getting all the equipment and everything like that, they get to try it out first. And then at the end of the season, they're not, committed to this hive or this equipment. So it's been really nice. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a little background on the business and then go into how it relates to this policy and specifically pesticides. Bees are facing a lot of issues these days, but like Lex was saying, we really need to tackle the pesticide problem, because I feel like bees, their health is compromised as a result of these toxins, and we have the power to keep these toxins out of the environment. And so why they're in the environment, what they're doing, what they're benefiting, what are the costs, and looking at that. So this is 2013, our first pesticide kill experience was in the city of Minneapolis. And next slide. We went under investigation with the University of Minnesota Bee Lab and the Department of Ag to find out what killed our bees. And we were, it was our hive and the hives of 2 other beekeepers in Minneapolis. And so we found out what killed our bees, but we didn't find out who did it, which on an advocacy level was kind of great, because this is a big problem, and it's not about one person applying one thing. It's about what are we doing as a society to our landscapes, how are we viewing them, and why is this happening? So, next slide. As a result of this, we started a campaign called Healthy Bees, Healthy Lives. We asked people to do these 4 things, and it was really great. The movement, the momentum that we had. Next slide, please. We threw a big party. This was during the 2014 legislative session called the Dandelion Honey Pastry Challenge. I know dandelions are a sore subject, but the reality is right now in our lawns we are trying to get rid of dandelions. So I think it's a way to bring into the conversation that bees do need dandelions, and they are there right now, and we can work towards a better landscape of plants that are maybe more appropriate than dandelions, Julia. But right now, how do we get the general public to be really thinking about how we view our landscapes? So Aaron and I, we spent countless hours of not being paid to go to the Capitol and fight for what had happened to us and protecting our bees. And we testified 5 times that session for the 2 bills that you've heard a lot about tonight. Next slide. So the beekeeper compensation bill that passed in 2014. I don't need to go into this too far, I don't think. Next slide. And then the nursery labeling bill. Next slide, please. For our own campaign, In 2015, these laws had passed, and we were really excited about the success of pollinator legislation in Minnesota. And lots of groups have formed since then. Aaron mentioned a lot of them, and we're forming at the same time that we were doing our work. And so in 2015, we, as a business, as a for-profit business, wanted to really continue to impact people's purchasing power and also try to get habitat out in the world. So we came up with these pollinator patch kits. Next slide. And it's really small pollinator garden that businesses and people can buy in the city who maybe don't have a lot of gardening experience and support pollinators. So it comes with everything you need and a gift card to a local landscaping company that we know where the plants are coming from. So can you press play on that? So in 2015, you know, we were really excited to go back to being beekeepers and producing honey and teaching people about bees. And this is supposed to be a video playing of this bee that is experiencing our second pesticide kill, which happened this past May. And we're currently under an investigation with the Department of Ag to figure out the results and whether we're eligible for compensation. But the reason I wanted to come here tonight was to talk about the fact that, you know, there's a ton of really great things happening around bees and pollinators, but this is still a problem. And as a beekeeper, we manage over 100 hives between the city and the surrounding areas along the St. Croix River Valley, parts of Wisconsin, and this happened to us again. So next slide. It's not going to work. We partnered with landowners and also beekeepers who had hives to on 80 acres of organic land, but next to their 80 acres is a giant cornfield. And on a Friday in May, the farmer was planting his corn, and the next day, the landowners called me and they said our bees are dying and they're pouring out of the hives, and I was like, oh great, again. I've been through this, I know what to do, so we called the Department of Ag, we called the University of Minnesota Bee Lab to get another investigation underway to figure out what happened. So they came out, it happened on a Friday, the Department of Ag came out on a Monday to collect samples of our bees. Next slide. 11 days later, I don't know how well you can see this and what you know about honeybees and the way that they reproduce, but these particular hives, we spent a lot of money and time on these hives because they were breeder queens, which bees that are naturally mite resistant or have been bred to be resistant to mites. We used only organic treatments. We put them on organic land, and we did everything in our power on our end that we could do to keep them safe. This is a picture of the inside of the hive. None of the bees, the nurse bees in the hive, were tending to any of the young. The queen was laying multiple eggs in cells, which means she's failing. She was also laying eggs on larval cells, which is where queens don't lay eggs because there's already a developing larva there. It's pretty apparent what had happened, right? Next slide. So this year, at the same time that this happened to us, the beekeeper compensation bill changed in that we would have to be registered with Driftwatch. Now, this happened to us, I'm not sure the timing of if in May in 2015 the law passed, this happened to us in May in 2015. If we're eligible or if we pass that point, I still need to figure that out, but the investigation, like I said, is still going on. This happened in May. It's almost October, and we're still waiting to find out. And so if you register with Driftwatch, there's a problem as a beekeeper. Next slide, please. According to the EPA, if our bees in fact died from the corn planting, which is the seed coating on that corn seed from the dust, that's not considered a pesticide application by the EPA. So because it's on the seed, and so would we even be eligible if we were registered with Driftwatch for compensation based on that fact? I still don't know. And so we did all that work. I thought it was pretty ironic that we campaigned for these laws, and then we were there as victims of those laws too, or to see, not victims, but guinea pigs, to see if they work for beekeepers, right? Next slide, please. And this year, this is my 5th year keeping bees. As a business owner, it seems kind of crazy that you would invest, like we did, thousands of dollars in honeybees to produce a product, to teach people about bees, to try and make a living as a beekeeper, when every spring you have to worry about whether or not your hives are going to get hit by a corn planting or something else. So many beekeepers, one of the advantages of moving them out of the state of Minnesota, they will wait until after corn planting to bring their bees back to avoid that from happening. But to me, that's crazy. I grew up in Minnesota. I want to keep bees in Minnesota. Like Aaron said, it used to be a really friendly place for beekeepers. My uncle's been doing it for 40 years in northern Minnesota. He used to overwinter his bees. He doesn't anymore. Bees can make it through our winters if they're healthy and they have enough to eat. I went down to Arkansas this October, first time considering this. Is it better business for me to take all of my 100 hives from all organic farms, move them down to Arkansas for the winter because I have a friend who has an organic farm down there, and bring them back after corn planting to avoid that? Now, I don't want to do that because it involves buying a big truck with a trailer. I cross state lines with different laws. I have to think about it. And our whole class, Camp Bee's Knees, is about promoting sustainable beekeeping, meaning overwintering your hives here. But how can we teach that if this is the reality? So I'm not trying to bring the room down, which I probably did, but these are realities that real people, beekeepers, are facing. And so as we move forward with real change and real legislation, I want you to keep this in mind. This is what beekeepers think about every single year. And it's the beekeepers, like my uncle, commercial beekeepers, I talk to a lot of them, and most of them have a pesticide kill story. Most of them. And what if every one of them reported it? What would that look like? But not everybody does, because it takes a long time. You may not get compensated for that loss. And you just move on. And some beekeepers have pride about whether their bees live or not. And so, other beekeepers, well, they're just a bad beekeeper if they get hit by pesticides. You got to move your bees. I've seen whole operations move from Minnesota, move their families to Texas or South Dakota. And that's crazy to me. This is Minnesota. We should be able to keep our bees alive. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Bruce Fisher, another beekeeper.
Well done, Christy. And I am just a hobbyist beekeeper. So I keep 3 or 4 or 5 hives. This year it was only 2. And in the past I've kept as many as 5 or 6. And it used to be fun. It's not so much fun anymore. But anyway, I thought when this thing started, I thought, boy, my dad would sure love to be here. He graduated from the University of Minnesota St. Paul campus in 1934. And he went on to teach VOAG. Ever heard of VOAG? Vocational agriculture, teaching farmers how to farm more efficiently. And he started out in Renville, Minnesota. Anyway, and he wound up in Elborn because it was $10 more per month. This back in Depression days. He could move from Renville up to Elborn and get $10 more per month for teaching. Can you imagine? Move it up a little bit. Okay, thank you. So anyway, that's my story. Anyway, I used to keep bees up here on White Bear Avenue, 1.5 miles north of here, between Batteries Plus and the bank. I had 5 hives right in the backyard, no problem. And we used to get 100 pounds per hive. This was back in the good old days. Matter of fact, I used to have my daughter come home from first grade and help me crank. That's a lot of honey. 100 pounds per hive. We had 500 pounds one year. That was amazing. And my daughter right now, she's got my 2 hives in her backyard up here about a half mile from us. And I'd have them in my own yard, but I've got neighbors that have a pool. And one of the first rules of beekeeping is you got to be a good neighbor. And the bees just migrate to water. So I have my bees in her yard rather than mine, otherwise I would be a bad neighbor. So anyway, we keep it short and sweet. I shipped my bees to California here about a month ago because some gal over in Dresser, she takes a bunch of bees out to California so they can survive the winter and maybe come back stronger in the spring. How do you like that? Anyway, I have much more, I've got way more bee equipment than I need right now. If anybody here wants to get into beekeeping, give me a call, and I might have some equipment I can sell you because I got way too much equipment. So that's it. I'm going to keep it short and sweet. That's it, folks. Thank you.
I think we had 3 folks from the city of Maplewood, and they've condensed it to 1. Is that correct? So Virginia? Okay. Virginia Gaynor, Natural Resources Coordinator.
Thank you. Thank you, and not only did we condense it, but we're going to skip the PowerPoint and get it down to 2 minutes. And I think we can do an okay job with that, okay? It's been a long night, but it's been really exciting, so thanks, everyone. I want to tell you very briefly about a really fun grant and project that the City of Maple is working on. We've got 2 nonprofit partners, Great River Greening and the Xerxes Society. This is an LCCMR grant, so we're grateful for the funding from the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. It just started in July, and we've already hit the ground running. So there's 5 pieces for the grant. We're working at Maplewood's Fish Creek site. The first part is habitat enhancement. We've heard a lot about that tonight. The second part is Xerxes Society, our partner, is pulling together this pollinator guide for native bees, for monitoring native bees. And so this has become, we'll be teaching this program over the next 3 years. So we want to encourage you, if you know people that are interested in native bees and learning about them and in actually doing monitoring on sites, we got a program started. We had our first training in September. It was really successful. So we're doing 4 adult education sessions with this protocol. And then this will actually be available. We just had a draft available for our training this year, but it'll be available next year on Xerxes' website for the general public to use. So in addition to the 4 adult trainings, we're actually doing monitoring at our Fish Creek site using this new protocol. The protocol has been simplified so citizen scientists can do it. Xerxes has broken it down into about 9 or 10 morphological groups for bees, so we're not learning all 350 or 400 native Minnesota bees. We're breaking it down so it's accessible to citizens. And they find that it is valuable data. We got really excited during our training because at the Maplewood Nature Center we had amazing native bee diversity in our gardens right in front of the Nature Center. When we took that out to our Fish Creek site, which is a brand new restoration, it's completely different. So there's going to be lots, if people will use a protocol like this regionally, we'll be able to compare data from community to community. So we know we're going to go beyond our Fish Creek site and do it at several other sites in the city of Maplewood. And then in addition to the adult education, one piece of the puzzle is we are also teaching school children. So in the next 3 years, we're bringing 800 school children out to the Fish Creek site to learn about pollinators, to help with some of the habitat enhancement. The Nature Center is also doing classroom sessions with the kids. What we find is they're crazy when they get out in the field. So we really have to set the stage, give them a little bit of training in the classroom before they get out to the Fish Creek site. And my colleague Oakley, our naturalist and educator, she's here with me tonight, as well as our park director. So we'll be here to take any questions that you may have from us later. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're actually ending on time, and I thank the speakers for condensing some of it. You've had a lot of information tonight, and there's a lot of information, again, available on the tables at the entranceway of the community center. But I want to go back to a couple questions that were asked, for us as policymakers. We do often hear the science, some of us, We often have people come to the legislature and present information to us. But why do bad things happen? Why do bad things happen? Bad things happen when people aren't involved, and when we need to have more people holding elected officials accountable. Those of us, if you don't like the way we're voting, you need, when we come around and knock on your door and ask for your vote, you need to tell us. And you need to tell us you're not going to vote for us unless we change our behavior. It's that simple. Whether you're a local elected official or whether you're in the legislature or whether you're in Congress. These issues are very important. We're talking, we all eat. Leon, some of us eat a little more than others, and we all drink water. And it's important. So we need to have people involved. And we did pass a lot of legislation that was a model for many states. And the analogy that Representative Lilly mentioned is, it is very fun to blow up the Death Star, to pass legislation and to achieve something, a group of rebels trying to achieve something. But the empire always strikes back. The empire always strikes back. But there's always a return of the Jedi. So I'd ask all of you, to keep being involved, because this is not a one-year and done issue. This is a long-term struggle that's involved, and we have done great things. The legislation saying that with the public dollar we use pollinator habitat is a game changer, and that's the model that the federal government adopted. But we can plant all that habitat. If it's sterile, it's not going to have bees or bugs or anything else. So I'd ask you to stay involved. Talk to your friends and talk to your neighbors. Now, maybe you disagree with what I just said. You have the opportunity to hold me accountable or us accountable as well. Everybody, democracy requires participation, whether it's at the local level, state level, federal level. We need you to be involved. We need you to express your opinion. We need you to email us. We need you to confront us or cajole us or cooperate with us or convince us. There may be things that we don't know. Well, actually, there's quite a few things we don't know, but we need to know your opinion and your ideas because there's a lot we have done, but there's a lot that we can do. So I want to thank Representative Lilly, all the co-sponsors, all of our staff who've been working on this, and Leon has a few words at the end.
Thank you. I just want to start with a quick apology. We have some national parks people here too, and we didn't. That's my oversight. I didn't include them, but they're out doing good work on this, on these issues as well. Thank you to Maplewood for hosting us and offering this. Thank you for the cable folks for filming this. It's going to be, I think next week they'll be showing it. And you could also ask to spread the story. You can ask for tapes from the Ramsey Washington Cable Commission, probably ask for copies of it and then run it in South St. Paul or all over the state. So please consider that. Just want to thank Representative Hansen. He is a great advocate and early in the game, he was really big on this ditch buffer thing, and none of us knew what the heck a ditch buffer was. And he was fighting for that and buffers, and we're like, what are you talking about, us Metro people? But now it's, we get it, and it's going statewide. It's an amazing platform that we've really moved the needle on. Thank you for, I just want to thank my staff. Amanda did a great job. She's a beekeeper herself. They live in Cottage Grove, and they have some bees that they're working, and then some other staff here. Nanette stepped up and did a great job on our IT problem, and thank you for that. And Mary next to her, always so helpful. And Lil, I don't know where you are, and then Nancy, there, and then Nancy Livingston, Senator Uyghur's staff. Again, the legislators that are here, we were Senator Uyghur and Representative Fisher and Representative Ward, and we were joined by Representative Uruso and then Representative Dean from Minneapolis even. So that was pretty neat to have them over. I just really enjoyed this learning moment for us too. I didn't know that bees and whatnot ate trees, so that was interesting. Dandelions, I'll have to back off on that. And then mosquitoes are out there pollinating as well. So there were some, I'm just kind of kidding, but I mean, these are real learning moments that you don't expect that. But I think in the end, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming out and telling your story. And it was long, but I didn't see really any nodding, so that's pretty neat. And I think I'm going to go back to what Aaron's words were. We all love Minnesota, and we can all, we can do that by actions, encouraging us, like Representative Hansen said, to vote right and do the right things, but to work with our departments and other people out in the community. So thank you for coming, everybody, and I hope you had a good time. Good night.